Buenos días and welcome to Comunidad del Valle, and have a happy Mother's Day. This morning we're going to do things a little bit differently here on Comunidad del Valle. We will debate Proposition 227. On our right for the debate tonight, this morning, will be Ron Unz. Ron is the president and CEO of Wall Street Analytics in Palo Alto. He has undergraduate and graduate degrees from Harvard, Cambridge, and Stanford Universities. In 1994, Ron Unz received 34% of the votes in a Republican primary against Governor Pete Wilson. With him is Fernando Vega. Fernando is past member of the Redwood City Board of Education and of the Redwood City City Council. In 1992, he was chosen by the Clinton Gore campaign to hold regional drive to recruit Latino voters. He was successful in recruiting 18,000 Latino voters in that region. He helped establish bilingual education programs while on the Redwood City Board of Education. On our left, we have Assemblyman Mike Honda. He's a former teacher and principal here in San Jose, also a former member of the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors. He's leading the campaign against Proposition 227 in Sacramento, and he was quoted of saying in the San Jose Mercury News that Proposition 227 is the most devious, un-American proposition anyone ever visited on our children. With Assemblyman Mike Honda is Dr. Sarah Garcia from Santa Clara University. Dr. Garcia is Director of Teacher Education Programs. She has a PhD in Educational Psychology from UC Santa Barbara. She published the article Origin and Destinies, a Mayday Mexican Corrida and Symbolic Personal Legacy. Good morning to all of you, and thank you so much for coming here. We'll start with you, Ron. We're going to start with a 1-minute opening statement from each party, and we'll start with Ron.
Well, I think bilingual education was a very well-intentioned government program when it was begun 30 years ago, but it's never worked properly. Right now in the state of California, hundreds of thousands of children are placed in classes where they're taught almost no English during the school year. And because of that, they never learn, in many cases, to read and write English properly. The official government statistics today say that 95% of the children every year who start a school year not knowing English have not learned English by the end of that school year. And that's the reason we have to end this program, pass Prop 227, and teach English to all these children as quickly as possible once they begin school.
Okay. Assemblyman Mike Honda.
The reason I'm opposing your initiative, Mr. Unz, the Proposition 227, is because as an educator, I believe that your methodology is untested. It has no data to support that it is successful. Other things about the Proposition 227 is that it takes away local control from the local school boards. They're the ones that should really decide what's going to be best for the communities, because the communities are so diverse in the state of California. The other point is that it takes away the ability of teachers to be able to teach to the children in the ways that they've been trained. Your initiative says that they shall teach English only in English and in no other way. That attacks their ability to teach with the skills that they've learned over the years, and also it attacks their academic freedom. It also sets up children for failure. Essentially, if you're a kindergartner, you're saying to a child who comes in that they have to learn to speak English in 180 days against children who have been speaking English since they were born for 5 years, and if you count the womb, it's 5 years, 9 months.
Okay, that's 1 minute. Somebody with Mike Honda will have a whole half hour to talk about how we feel about Prop 227. Tell us essentially, Mr. Unz, what is in your proposition? What will you do with our kids?
It's a very simple idea. Once children begin school, if they don't already know English, they would generally be placed in a short-term, intensive, sheltered English immersion program to teach them English as quickly as possible. Once they learned enough English to do regular schoolwork in English, they would be moved into the regular classes with all the other children. Now, our proposition doesn't outlaw bilingual education. Those parents who wanted to place or keep their children in a bilingual program could apply for a waiver to do so. But I think most parents want their children taught English as quickly as possible once they begin school.
Will it work having Cambodian, Vietnamese, Filipino students, having them in one classroom for 1 year? Do you think that will help them? Will that help them succeed?
Oh, I think very much, because besides the fact that all of them will be learning English together, since they come from so many different ethnic backgrounds, they'll get to know children from other ethnic backgrounds. Today, many of these bilingual programs really amount to racial segregation. In other words, all of these different ethnic groups are kept in classes with only people from their own ethnic group. And I think it's better if children get to know children from lots of different backgrounds, which would happen under our initiative.
That's really inaccurate. I was a bilingual teacher, and I also had bilingual schools. I was a principal. I had bilingual Cambodian, bilingual Vietnamese, and bilingual Spanish. And in the classroom, we had a mixture of youngsters in there because you had to have English models in the classroom while you instructed to the children. And so, you know, primary language is an instructional tool. It's not a crutch like people say. And if you say that the children are not learning English and 95% of them are failing, it's because they're all being taught in English.
But that isn't true. I mean, again, look at the government statistics, and not only that, but again, most of these statistics are controlled by the bilingual education establishment. So it's hard for us to find out what the true numbers were. But in Los Angeles,
what are the true numbers?
Excuse me,
Tell us the true numbers.
I'll tell you the true numbers. In Los Angeles, they did a study, and LA has half of all the bilingual students in the entire state, and they showed when you look at children who started a bilingual program in kindergarten, after 6 straight years in bilingual education, 2/3 of them had still not learned enough English to even take a test in English. And that's what I call failure. 6 years in bilingual education, and 2/3 had still not learned English.
Okay, we will continue this debate when we continue here on Comunidad del Valle. We'll talk to Fernando Vega, who supported bilingual ed and now is opposed to it, and also to Dr. Sarah Garcia. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Comunidad del Valle. This morning we are debating Proposition 227 on the June 2nd primary ballot here in the state of California. We'll go to you, Fernando, this time. You were an advocate of bilingual education at one point, and now you are against it. Tell us why.
Well, because it has failed. Bilingual education has been a failure for 25 years. The concerns Mike Honda has expressed here about the initiative, let me remind him that the initiative has never been acted upon here in California. He speaks about the initiative, but I wish he would address himself to the failure of bilingual education for 25 years. This initiative has not been tried at all. I mean, it's going to be implemented when it gets voted on June the 2nd. Let's talk about the bilingual education. Why is it that we want to terminate it? Because it has been a tremendous failure, and it affects the Latino kids throughout the state of California.
Is it really affecting Latino kids up in? Tell us about how it's doing that, if you can.
Well, the failure rate, even at the University of California, we have, 2.5 eligible students that qualify to go into the university or go to the university out of 100. You know, I used to have a grocery store, and we used to have a box of apples, 100 apples, and by 2 o'clock we'd sell them all. But here, under the bilingual, you know, if we're only selling 3 apples, we're not going to stay in business, are we? So this is the bilingual education can still have such a tremendous failure and still make money. This is the only program that I know in the United States, this country, where you can have such a tremendous failure and still make money at it. We're, you know, it's costing the taxpayers $4.2 billion.
How about ludicrous? Bilingual education is only 0.4% of the total budget of public education in the state of California. Period. That's statistics.
Mike, it's here right out of the California Education Funding Alert. It comes right, the information comes right out of
Well, how about that, Dr. Garcia?
Let me recap a little on what Ron stated earlier about the Los Angeles School District. First of all, I think that if you pull the statistics, if you look at the specifics of how LA Unified operates and the different kinds of programs that serve the needs of different types of learners, you're glossing over the main issue. Bilingual education has never been about eliminating English. It's always been about maintaining 2 languages and using it as a tool to transition children into English environments, English mainstream classrooms. If we initiate something like the UNS Amendment, we go back to what was there before in 1965, when it was total submersion. And many teachers do not know how to utilize sheltered English, and you're only giving them a year and constraining them to be able to meet the needs, the diverse needs of children in a very short time. Bilingual education means many, many different things. There's different types of programs, and the statistics and the budgets that you're citing only deal with particular types of programs. If you look at the way the statistical analysis is done in LA Unified, you see that they're pulled with other schools all over. LA Unified is a huge, humongous district. There's never been an adequate implementation of programs, not because there wasn't a commitment on the part of bilingual educators, but because the resources were not allocated at the district level to be able to provide the quality education that bilingual education was meant to provide, starting with the university and all the way through. And there's been research to counter what Fernando's comment. There's been research that's been done on how bilinguals are the ones that are most successful going from elementary to high school and to the university. Cognitively, these people had more capacity for developing academic skills.
We're back to debate Proposition 227 here on Comunidad del Valle. First, next let's go to Assemblyman Mike Honda. Two questions here. One, are there problems with bilingual education?
Well, let me get back to Ron's comment about bilingual education, that you can't have bilingual education for all the kids, the 120 languages we have in the state of California. That's not the point. That's the problem. People don't understand what bilingual education really means. You take the principles of bilingual education, you apply it to youngsters, whether it's individuals or small groups or a whole school. It's the application and utilization of primary language as an instructional tool so that youngsters can understand what's being taught them. That's what bilingual education is all about. And you talk about English, that all these kids are failing. Let me tell you, here's some statistics for you to chew on.
Okay.
This is unfortunate, but today, in grades 9 through 12, Latino children, Latino students at the secondary schools are failing at 5.6%.
How much?
Twice as many as white students. But the black students, the African-American students, are failing at 6.6% grades 9 through 12. And they're all being taught in English. So it's really not the issue about bilingual education or anything else like that. There's something wrong in the educational system.
They're
all being taught in English.
Mike,
And so if we're going to apply
bilingual
English,
education is so important to the economy, global economy. I ask you, how many English-speaking students are in bilingual education? You know,
at River Glen,
River
we have a
40
total,
students
we
in
have
a year.
No, there are many other
no,
programs.
and,
River Glen, double immersion,
and it's being
double
done
immersion
right.
school.
And in Cupertino, they're looking at
what
another one.
percentage is that?
That's right.
What
Not
percentage?
enough. Not
Yeah,
enough.
not enough.
But if you say that globally that we want people to have at least 2 languages to be competitive in the world, why eliminate the language at the younger
The
age?
parents want their children to learn English.
Here's the
They
problem.
are
No one
learning
is saying
English.
that you shouldn't learn English.
Okay.
No one is saying that through the
At my
bilingual
house,
program
I have
that
this
you
sign
shouldn't
sticking
learn
out the
English.
window, and the day doesn't go by that people drop by and say, "Señor, I want my child to in your school. We want them to learn English."
Okay, we're
Every
going to
parent
have
wants
to
their
take
child to
another
learn
break.
English.
We're going to have to take another break, and then we'll be right back to kind of sum up our debate here on Comunidad del Valle. Proposition 227. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Comunidad del Valle. Now, a two-part question to the anti-227 side. Are there problems with bilingual education to this point? And if so, why hasn't anything been done to correct it in the last 25, 30 years?
Well, it's not an issue of what hasn't been done. It's an issue of looking at the status of the programs to begin with. From a pedagogical and from a social standpoint, bilingual education and the use of other languages for teaching and learning has always been seen as a remediality, not an enrichment. And you'll see the programs that have been successful are the ones that focus on enrichment, on connecting with the world and the cognitive flexibility of becoming bilingual and appreciating other cultures and languages. The second point is that part of the the major reason why bilingual programs have not worked as effectively as they should have been is because of the resource allocation. Initially, there were not enough bilingual teachers to staff the classrooms that needed bilingual instruction. There was not enough preparation programs in order to prepare teachers to deal with the kinds of pedagogies that they had to design to meet the needs of the bilingual learners or to help them transition from their native language to the second language. we have made a lot of headway with the CLAD, the Cross-Cultural Language and Academic Development Program, because it's not only bilingual teachers that are prepared to deal with linguistic diversity, it's all teachers in the state of California that are looking at the appreciation of language and culture and looking at ways of instructing that are from a point of view of empowering children and learning to look at the transition from a cultural linguistic perspective rather than from a remediality. And that has only been in effect for the last few years. So it's not just bilingual teachers that are involved in teaching linguistic or linguistically diverse learners. It's all teachers. All teachers in the state of California have to have those skills in order to do an adequate job of teaching.
Okay, Mr. Hans, how about, are there any good things to say about bilingual education as we have it now?
It was a very well-intentioned program, and in the state of California, I'm sure you can find a few individual cases where it does work. We're a very large state, and you can always find a few places where something works. But the statistics show that 95% of the children every year fail to learn English. And I'm a simple person. If I'm looking at statistics that say 95% of the children are failing to learn English every year, that looks to me like a program that's failed. It began with the best of intentions as an experimental program, but it's never worked on a large scale in 30 years of trying. And that's, I think, the reason we have to change it and have children taught English as quickly as possible. I'd also like to say that there's no other country anywhere in the world that uses what we call bilingual education. They all use the sort of short-term intensive language programs that our initiative proposes because that works, and transitional bilingual education just doesn't work. It's a nice idea, but it doesn't work in practice.
Can your initiative been written in a way where it would have started as a pilot project first and then gone into, I mean, if it worked?
Well, I mean, the problem there is we have an experimental program. The experimental program is called bilingual education. We've been experimenting with it for 30 years and it's never worked. And I think at the end of 30 years of experimentation, we should end the experiment if it's failed and go back to a simple idea, which is just that you teach children English as quickly as possible once they begin school, and then they'll learn English quickly and move into regular classes. And again, of all the immigrant groups in California, most of these groups don't get bilingual education, and they do much better than the groups that get bilingual education.
Is it hurting our kids? Are we hurting them by teaching them in a bilingual manner?
Look, the years that I've taught, it has not hurt them. And like you said, Ron, there are places where it works. Where it's applied properly, it works. You say 95% of the youngsters are failing to learn English. It's because those 95% are being taught only in English. They're not being offered the ability to have the primary language as part of their instructional methods. Let's talk about your initiative. It says here that all children in California public schools shall be taught English by being taught in English. And there's no, when you start to interpret laws, no matter how well-intentioned people are prior to election, it's how the words are interpreted, and that's what's going to happen. That's what happened in Prop 13. So, you know, the intention's not going to be interpreted. So people are going to read that and say, you have to teach these children in English and only in English, period. So it's unfortunate, but a philosopher once said, the problem with a simple solution to a complex problem is that it simply doesn't work.
That's not what our initiative says, and we have a secret weapon, I'd like to say. It's called the voter pamphlet. I urge everyone to read this pamphlet, read the text of the initiative, and read the arguments on both sides. And once you do, you'll see that our initiative is the right way to go.
How about this comment here, Mr. Ahn? This was presented by Mike Honda in an article in the San Jose Mercury News. And is this true, Assemblyman Honda? You called it the most devious un-American proposition anyone ever visited on our children.
That's correct.
I like to say something. I have something very much the same.
Sure.
The only thing is that what I say is bilingual education is a cruel hoax and a sham perpetrated on the most vulnerable, defenseless children in our society. Is because la raza de nosotros, our people, do not vote. If we voted, believe me, that we would be better provided services in the area of education. It's not bilingual education. For many years it hasn't been bilingual education. It's been Spanish all the way through, and the parents are saying, we can teach Spanish to our kids at home. We want English. And why are they forcing children of Spanish-speaking ancestry and that were born here and know English, why are they being forced in bilingual education? Other nationalities are not.
Okay.
Those bilingual education, those programs that are funded, if people are forced to stay in there, it's a violation of federal law.
There are a lot of violations of federal
There's
law
a lot
right
of
now.
violations.
And also, the other thing I'd like to say about the current system that makes it so bad is the schools are paid more money so long as children don't learn English. If children learn English, the schools lose money. And
You know,
that gives the schools...
That's really
No,
a
but
big
it's true.
insult
And-
for all
and
those
that-
people who work in the schools.
Excuse me.
That's right.
They do not keep the kids in the classroom for the money.
But
They
isn't
do
it-
not do that.
I'd
Yeah,
like to
they
say
do.
something.
Yeah.
You look at the amount of money that's being invested in bilingual education. It's a drop in the
Can I ask you
bucket.
something?
The problem with public
But,
education
excuse
is
me,
that
can
we
I
don't
ask-
support
can-
public
can
education
I-
as its entity.
Can I ask you something? Is it smart to have a system right now where, regardless of how well-intentioned the teachers are, the teachers and the administrators know that if children learn English, the schools lose money? I think that's a bad way to design a system.
Okay, we have,
I think that's
we're going to
a way
we're
off
going to
of
give
that
each
comment.
party here 30 seconds to kind of, we're going to give each other a minute, but we kind of got off track here. Let's give each other 30 seconds to kind of closing statements and see why we should vote against 227, why we should vote for 227. We'll start with Assemblyman Honda. 30 seconds.
227 is an untested methodology that's going to be placed upon youngsters, and they're going to be put in a classroom and congregate in the classroom and given one form of instruction. Children do not learn that way. Teachers shouldn't be able to teach that way. And this approach, if you read it clearly, it's untenable and it doesn't work for our kids.
Okay.
227 is hazardous to our children's health.
Okay. Mr. Runs.
Bilingual education is a proven failure after 30 years of trying. Our initiative says that children should be taught English as quickly as possible once they begin school. If a child is coming from a Spanish-speaking family, the schools are necessary to teach that child English. And once the child learns English, the child becomes truly bilingual. And that's what our initiative will do. It'll support bilingualism by getting rid of bilingual education.
Okay, thank you so much. We hope that we've answered your questions. If you're still in limbo as far as how you're going to vote on Proposition 227, remember that Election Day is on June 2nd. You can call your local polling place or the registrar of voters to find out where you are going to vote. But do read, as Mr. Unz announced, read the voter pamphlet, your voter guide, to find out more information. There's also a forum on bilingual education that we need to give you. It's happening on Saturday, May 16th from 9 to 12 at San Jose City College. It is an open forum, pros and cons of bilingual education. Thank you so much for coming again this morning, and please go out to the polls and vote on June 2nd. Thank
Read
you.
the initiative.
Read the initiative.
Welcome to Cable Co-op's Newswatch. Bilingual education, is this an issue you know very much about? Well, there's some very important things about to happen in that field, and believe it or not, they've all begun here in Palo Alto. So stay with us and we'll talk about just that, bilingual education. You're watching Cable Co-op's Newswatch. Our subject is bilingual education, and I didn't mean for my intro to send you running down to 25 Churchill to see what our school board is doing about the kids in this town here. It's a statewide issue, but a very important thing is happening that began here with the gentleman that's our guest today, Mr. Ron Unz of Palo Alto, who is the man behind Proposition 227, which will be on the ballot this June, and I was going to explain it as this is something which will eliminate bilingual education in California. And I think you probably would like to respond to that statement.
Well, it wouldn't completely eliminate bilingual education or outlaw it. What it would allow is those parents who want bilingual education for their children could apply for a waiver to have their children placed or kept in a bilingual program. But for the overwhelming majority of the children right now in bilingual education, they would be shifted over to programs of intense English immersion, sheltered immersion, to teach them English as soon as they start school instead.
Okay, well, Mr. Jones, let me first, you got into your answer so fast I didn't have a chance to thank you for joining us, and I do appreciate it. I should mention that Mr. Unz is a Silicon Valley entrepreneur in the financial software field, and as I mentioned, he is a Palo Alto resident. He was a candidate for governor not very long ago, and is Republican in background, so that should cover your background pretty well. Let's get into this issue, and let's start in a very simple place. Why are you so involved in this issue? What's driving Ron Unz here?
Well, I've been interested in the issue of bilingual education for many, many years, at least 10 or 15 or 20 years. I come from a little bit of an immigrant background myself. For example, my mother, even though she was born in Los Angeles, grew up not speaking a word of English. She spoke her family's language at home, and then her parents taught her a little bit of English right before she started school, and then once she started kindergarten, she learned English very quickly and easily, and actually ended up graduating college with a degree in English literature. So I've always been very skeptical of why bilingual education was necessary and why children who don't know English shouldn't just be taught English as soon as they start school. But the origins of this particular initiative campaign came in 1996 when I read a series of articles in Los Angeles Times describing how a group of immigrant Latino parents in downtown Los Angeles actually had to begin a public boycott of their local elementary school because the school refused to teach their children English. Now that seemed very strange to me.
It's a pretty strong statement. The school refused to teach their children English.
That's why it got a lot of attention. I mean, in fact, it made it into some of the national media.
Was that the sort of thing that just triggered you and said, this makes me, I'm just damn mad, won't take it anymore, and you wanted to do something about it?
Well, I mean, it made me want to investigate the story to see whether it was really true or not, because it seemed like a very strange story. In other words, I'd always thought of bilingual education as being a failure. But when it reaches the point where parents have to carry picket signs outside their local school because it refuses to teach English, it seemed to have gone over to the realm of insanity. So when I had some time and I was down in Los Angeles, I met with some of the parents involved in the boycott and also met with the local immigrant rights activist who was working with them just to find out whether the stories were true or not. And it turned out they were all completely true, and many of the worst aspects of the current system hadn't even gotten into the press.
Was this something that happened, just to get a context, before or after your campaign for governor?
Oh, it was afterwards, a couple of years afterwards.
So it wasn't a component of that race then?
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, even during my campaign, and long before then, I at times read articles in the paper about groups of Latino parents protesting bilingual education, but none of them had really gotten the attention of that particular boycott in Los Angeles in 1996.
Well, if we can then, in brief form, if you will, because our time is limited, what exactly will happen if Prop 227 is passed? What will be the structural change in our schools with regard to the teaching of language?
Sure. What the initiative would say is that when children start school in California, if they don't already know English, they would normally be put in an intensive, sheltered English immersion program to teach them English as quickly as possible. And then once they learned English, after generally a year or less, they'd be moved into a regular class with all the other children.
So is this built into the initiative that these special programs for non-English speaking students would be put in place by our school?
Oh, exactly.
System? This would be mandated on the school system?
Right, exactly.
So it's not a case of, at least as I've heard it presented, that you just simply eliminate it and the kids are on their own. You'd put some structure in place and that would be mandated.
Oh, exactly. In other words, the way it would work is those parents who really wanted their children in a bilingual program could apply for a waiver to have their children placed or kept in a bilingual program. But for all the other children who didn't know English, they would just be put in these intensive, sheltered English immersion classes to teach them English as quickly as possible.
So it sounds like our schools would still be in the business under this proposition of teaching in languages other than English.
Well, I mean, to some extent. In other words, obviously,
on a parallel path is the way it sounds from the way you describe it.
Right. I mean, the thing is, for those parents, and probably would be only a fraction of them, that wanted bilingual education, those programs would continue. Obviously, foreign language programs would continue in the normal way in the public schools. And for example, well, I mean, there are some English-speaking children whose parents want them in special Chinese immersion programs or Spanish.
Well, those are like electives, though. I'm thinking of the mainstream education in the schools.
Sure.
Would be English-based in
exactly,
the system.
exactly.
And that if you want to have teaching in Spanish or Tagalog or one of the other languages, that would be a parallel path for the students. They'd still have to attend the other classes as well, or would they start out in their language path and then move over as soon as they're proficient?
Well, you would move over, but these English immersion classes are taught in English. In other words, they're not taught in the child's native language. Now, they can use some of the child's native language, but the overwhelming majority of the instruction is in English. So in other words, these programs would teach children English by teaching them in English, as opposed to bilingual education, which really, to be perfectly honest, is more of a form of Spanish-only instruction with almost no English
Well,
being taught.
you've put a couple things on the table
Sure.
there. Let's pursue the Spanish only first.
Sure.
It sounds, again, from your statement that you feel that the motivation for bilingual education as it currently exists is the Hispanic community. It's the Spanish language issue.
No, not really. In other words, most Hispanic parents don't like bilingual education. According to all the public opinion polls, there's overwhelming support for our initiative to get rid of it. But on the other hand, the majority of the children in bilingual programs today are from a Spanish language background. For example, in California, of the children who don't know English in the public schools, 80% speak Spanish. And the next largest group after that are Vietnamese-speaking children, who are 3%. So it is overwhelmingly a Spanish language issue.
Yet it is also true, I think, and I have some personal experience in this. For example, I do some work in the city of Daly City, and we actually did some materials for them that had to be in 4 languages. And in addition to English, they were Tagalog, Spanish, and Mandarin.
Sure.
So there are different patterns in different communities.
Oh, exactly.
And given that, and I know, for example, that over in the East Bay, Union City has a very heavy Filipino community, so
Sure.
you're back to the Tagalog again. Isn't it appropriate that communities be able to set up programs that reflect the kind of ethnic base that they have within that community?
Right, but you see, the thing is, since the goal of bilingual education is really to teach the children English, and since it doesn't work, and let me just give you a couple of the statistics on it, because what had happened after I met with those parents was I investigated the statewide statistics on these programs, and they're unbelievably dreadful, much worse than I ever imagined.
Statistics in terms of?
In terms of language acquisition for limited English children in California. For example, in the state right now, and these are the official government statistics from the Office of Bilingual Instruction, 1/4 of all the children in California public schools don't know English. So it's a lot higher than a lot of people realize. And of the ones who don't know English, each year only 5 or 6% learn English. In other words, 95% of the children who start a given school year not knowing English end that school year still not knowing English, which is amazing.
The implication I could draw from what you just said is that we have children going through a system which has bilingual education
Exactly.
in place right now that are coming out the other end of the system undereducated. Is that correct?
Oh, tremendously.
That's your
Oh,
your
tremendously.
premise.
I mean, the numbers are unbelievable. For example, in Los Angeles, the LA Unified School District just completed a study focusing on students who'd started a bilingual program in kindergarten, and after 6 years in the program, over 2/3 of them had not learned enough English to even take a test in English.
But
And
they're
that's
still
after
getting
6 years.
classes in their language.
Right, it's all in Spanish. You see, again, the term bilingual education really is a misnomer, because for most of the students in California who are in bilingual programs, the program really is a Spanish-only program. There's almost no English being taught. And that's one reason they don't learn English, because it's hard to learn a language if you're not being taught the language.
I have so many things I want to explore in this. Let me take you back to the mechanics of the thing, and then,
Sure.
and then we can end up and talk some more about how this will work, 'cause I think there's some really interesting questions here. But I want to come back to the process of this thing being on the ballot. Clearly, for those of you watching this show, there's a lot to be learned about this, and I hope you will use this as a trigger to do your own self-education, as I will. But you've used the initiative process to move this forward. Why not go through the normal legislative process in this state?
You've raised a very good point. In fact, when I first began this campaign, a lot of people said, well, why didn't you try to do something through the state legislature? You've got to understand the law governing bilingual education in California expired 11 years ago. And for 11 straight years, the state legislature has been deadlocked on the issue of either renewing the law or modifying it or reforming it or doing something about it. So in other words, the State Department of Education has continued for 11 straight years to vigorously enforce an expired state law.
Did you try going through your legislative representatives to get some
No, it was
action on that?
completely impossible. In other words, you know, if they'd been deadlocked for 11 straight years.
So you just looked at the playing field and said, this is a no-win game, I'm going to the initiative
Oh,
process.
exactly, because after 11 years of deadlock, I don't think one person like me coming in from the side
Well-
would have changed them.
Well, one could argue, and there's a parallel here that intrigues me, and that is that many years ago, some people looked at the issue of property taxes, decided the legislature was never going to act on it. They passed a thing called Prop 13, which, well-intended though it may have been, had some very unhappy consequences, including for the schools. Don't you worry about something that doesn't go through the legislative process, like your initiative, having some unintended consequences that could be detrimental?
Well, to be perfectly honest, the legislative process seems many times to have even bigger problems than any other process. In other words, the legislation it produces tends to be very poorly designed also. And in this case, again, the law expired 11 years ago.
Of course, the
And
difference
nothing
is
has
that
been-
that's easier to fix than things that go into the Constitution.
Well, I mean, our initiative is not part of the Constitution.
Okay,
It's
fair
a
enough.
statutory initiative.
So
And
that
for
makes it
example,
easy to fix then.
It makes it easier to fix.
Easier,
In other
excuse
words,
me, poor choice
our
of word.
initiative could be modified by a 2/3 vote of the state legislature. So it would take a little bit more than a majority, but it certainly isn't written into the Constitution.
If we have time, I'll ask you about
Sure.
2/3 rules as well. But you said, you've used the phrase "our" a couple of times.
All right.
Who besides Ron Unz is behind this?
Well, I mean, what had really happened is I met with, again, the parents and local immigrant rights activists, and I talked with a lot of other people I know on the issue. Together, I probably played the largest role in drafting the initiative, but I talked and discussed it over with a lot of other people, got them involved, and then recruited other people to help in the campaign. So, for example, the honorary chairman of our campaign is Jaime Escalante, the world-famous East LA calculus teacher who's been fighting bilingual education for many, many years. The co-proponent on the initiative, the co-chairman of the campaign, is Gloria Mata-Tuckman, who's a first-grade teacher down in Santa Ana, who's been fighting bilingual education for many, many years. And so these are all people involved in the campaign with me, along with others.
But now you did say, again, I'm trying to pick up your words carefully here, the implication is that you or a very narrow group of people drafted this legislation. Let's be specific. Who did draft the legislation we'll be voting on?
Well, I drafted the core of it, and then I circulated around 15 separate drafts to probably about 40 or 50 different individuals around the country to get their input. And then, again, the drafting went through about 15 different versions of the initiative, getting feedback and
But there's
input
been
from
no
other people.
public meetings or public discussion or discourse on it. The
Just during the
campaign
campaign.
provides that.
Exactly.
So that if something has been missed by those who might have some opposition to it, they're going to have to go back to that 2/3 vote in the legislature if it passes.
Right, but nothing has really come up during the whole campaign. So in other words, and by the way, when I circulated around the drafts of the initiative, I circulated to some of the leading supporters of bilingual education in the country whom I met with.
And you got comments from them?
Oh yes, exactly.
And did any of those comments get into your drafting?
Well, actually, they didn't give me comments on the actual drafting of the initiative, even though I, had asked for them. I mean, they really just said that even though they felt bilingual education didn't really work well, they thought it might be made to work in the future, and so they hoped I wouldn't go ahead with the initiative to get rid of it.
Well, it sounds like you are going to go ahead, and we're going to go ahead and take a break right now. We'll be back in just a moment with more on bilingual education in California. You're watching Cable Co-op's Newswatch. Our subject is bilingual education in California. Our guest is Mr. Ron Unz, a Palo Alton who is the driving force behind Prop 227, which will make some, I'll say this time, significant changes in bilingual education, or how we teach our children of different languages in this state. We talked, as we're going to our break, we talked about the campaign and who's behind it, and let me just ask this much more about that aspect of it. When you went out to qualify this initiative for the ballot, who paid for that?
Okay, well, I put in probably over half of all the money myself, and I talked to various friends of mine and persuaded them to put in money as well. But overall, this is a very popular issue, and this initiative really, I think, will take less money to qualify and win than almost any other initiative in California history.
Well, you've already qualified it, so it's
Right.
a case of it being on the ballot. But now let's talk about the campaign.
Sure.
Again, I hope to get to this question in a little broader sense, but we are experiencing in contemporary politics these days what people of considerable means can do to impact the political system with their own money.
Sure.
And you were a person of some success and means, and therefore are in that position to do that where others may not be. Here's a campaign that is going to have an effect on people at the most basic level, their children. Is it going to be a campaign in its favor financed by those people, or is it going to be financed by a few people with a lot of means?
Well, to be perfectly honest, this is a very cheap campaign, and I don't think there's going to be that much money spent one way or the other. I mean, to give you an
Do
example.
you think you can run a cheap campaign statewide in California? I'm
To
amazed
be
at that
honest,
statement.
I've only spent a few $100,000, and I mean, the whole campaign, I think, is going to be one of the least
Does
expensive.
that include, excuse me, but that includes qualifying it? That
Yeah,
seems
sure,
very
exactly.
cheap to me
It
to
is very,
qualify.
like I said, it's a very cheap campaign. And the other side doesn't have much money either. They'll probably spend
Yeah, I
a
was
couple
coming to
million
that one.
dollars. So, I mean, this is not, the thing you've got to understand is this is the sort of issue most people feel fairly strongly about. And it's gotten a lot of coverage in the press. So, for example, according to the last poll that came out, the field poll, more people were familiar with this initiative by far than any of the candidates for governor, even though Checky had spent $18 million already. And we had more support in the most recent field poll among the people of California than all four candidates for governor combined.
That's
So I don't
because
think-
nobody can spell Checky or pronounce it.
Or Harmon, or Lundgren, or Greg
any of
Davis.
the others, that's
So
right.
I'm not, maybe it's the candidates being weak, but I mean, we have more support among the people of California than all four candidates for governor combined.
Does that suggest then that during the course of your signature gathering campaign that was easy to do, that you had a good response?
Oh, very strong response. In fact, most people seem to say, and we had organized signature gathering and volunteer signature gathering, but most people
And
seem
that
to-
was, I presume, had to be financed in some way.
Oh, exactly. And that's where, a few $100,000 was spent. But again, that's very little for an initiative campaign. And overall, most people seem to say this was one of the easiest initiatives to get signatures for that any of them had ever encountered.
I have to ask you this question because obviously we're going into campaign season, so
Sure.
we're going to be hearing a lot about it. You mentioned that the people against it, by the way, who are the people against it? Let's ask that
Really, it's
question.
mostly the bilingual education industry, because now...
There's an industry?
Oh, yeah, very much, because, I mean, right now the state of California, nobody knows how much is being spent on these programs.
Who comprises this industry?
Well, the bilingual coordinators and the bilingual administrators and the bilingual teachers and
So
the
you're saying
bilingual
people
academics.
whose salary depends on having
Oh,
bilingual
entirely,
programs.
yeah.
But wouldn't they have, in the construct that you described earlier, wouldn't they have a role in educating children through these other mechanisms?
Well, some of them would and some of them wouldn't. In other words, their jobs would certainly change, and people are reluctant to put their jobs at risk, even if their jobs might not really disappear. We're talking about a system right now that nobody knows how much money is spent in California, but if you're looking at the extra cost above and beyond the regular cost of educating children, the extra cost of educating limited English children in these programs, it's probably close to $2 billion a year. And
Well,
that's
that's actually
a lot of money.
a question I wanted to ask you from our first half, and too much to ask you about in too little time. Have you done an analysis that takes a look at the kinds of programs that would result if this legislation passes, as against what we have today,
Sure.
and try to get some sense, and again, this is where legislative process is probably going to be helpful, but get some sense of what the net cost difference is between the way we do it today and the way it would be done under the system that you propose?
Well, it's a difficult thing to prove, and conclusively.
Give me a ballpark.
Well,
What
I
is
mean,
your sense of it?
Well, I mean, I would say probably this initiative will save, a few $100 million a year, maybe $1 billion a year.
Even
in
though it does
California.
require other kinds of special programs to be put in place.
But here's the difference. You see, if you put children in an intensive, sheltered English immersion program, you teach them English, and then once they learn English, they're transitioned into regular classes. Under the current system of native language instruction, where they're taught only in their language, or almost only in their language for many years, they stay in these special programs, sometimes for 6 years or 8 years or even 10 years. So in other words, the time they stay in these special programs where they're not being taught English is much longer, and that's the reason that...
So as a former engineer, I can say to you the area under the curve is smaller, is what you're saying.
Oh, exactly. And so overall, it probably would save, I don't know, $1 billion a year, something like that.
Well, that's the subject, an answer that may come back to haunt you, or it may turn out to be your
But
finest,
nobody knows.
your finest campaign
Nobody
position.
knows.
One more question about the children that are involved. One can imagine very young children, first graders, coming in, they learn quickly, and they can learn a, quote, new language quickly if they're immigrant children. But what about the children that are 8th graders and 9th graders and so on, that have lived with a foreign language for a long time, and all of a sudden they're right in the middle of this system that's running pell-mell?
You've raised a very good point. I'd like to say that if you're talking about older children, children who are 12 or 13 or 14, I think you can make a very reasonable case in favor of bilingual education. In other
Well,
words,
how's that going to work if this passes?
Well, because then those children, in our initiative, children who are 10 and older would have a much easier time getting a waiver to have their parents place them in a bilingual program as opposed to an English-oriented program. But the interesting thing you said about younger children comes in two ways. First of all, almost all the children who don't know English in California public schools began in the schools here when they were 5 or 6 years old, in kindergarten or the first grade. In fact, over half of them were born right here in California. So they started school with all the other children in their neighborhood. The reason they're still classified as not knowing English in the teens is because they haven't been taught English for all the years they've been in school, which is a very strange policy.
Well, back to these older kids. Your legislation, I gather, provides through this waiver process for an easier, presumably easier process for them to not have to deal with the program as it's set up. But what I'm concerned about, does it again provide for some clear mechanisms so that children of that age group can get the special attention that they need?
Well, I mean, most immigrants that I've talked with think that even at that age, it's better if they intensively concentrate on learning English. But if their parents feel otherwise, the parents could simply go down to the school and apply for a waiver to have the children placed in a bilingual-oriented program.
But what if there is no bilingual program?
Well, if enough parents...
Unless it's mandated by the legislation, then the school may not offer it.
Right. What the initiative says is that if at least 20 children of a given grade level have their parents get a waiver to be in a bilingual program, the school has to offer it.
So that's the mandating aspect that I was fishing for there.
If it's less than 20, then the school has to allow them to transfer to another school, like a magnet school that does have a bilingual program.
So the danger would be for districts that are small, where the numbers of children in these categories are small, and the next school is a long distance away. So there may be some people that get caught in the dilemma of not being able to find a program.
There's actually a lot of evidence that even for older children, bilingual education isn't as good as as English language instruction. But the other thing you should be aware of, which is one of the strange things about bilingual education, the bilingual academics that designed and supported these programs actually believe that the older you are, the easier it is to learn another language. And so they say that young children have the hardest time learning a new language, while adults or teenagers have an easier time. And that's the reason they support bilingual education.
It seems counterintuitive.
It doesn't make any sense at all. And it's contradicted by all the scientific data, but that's what they believe.
We've talked about a lot of specific details here that relate to the program that you're talking about. You're about to embark upon a campaign, and you made a comment earlier about as people learn about the initiative. One of the difficulties of political campaigns, and I trust you would agree regardless of the subject, is that it's very hard in the emotion of a campaign, and this is one that could fall into that category very easily, for people to get the real hardcore facts about what it will do and what it won't do, because it gets emotionalized. There'll be things that have to do with race, there'll be things that have to do with charges of racism, all kinds of things will be floating around before we're done here. How well informed do you think you can make people, at least of your position, in the course of this campaign?
Well, I think people are fairly well informed already. In fact, the funny thing about the campaign is that even though our opposition is funded by the bilingual education industry, in all their materials and debate presentations and presumably in their advertising campaign, they're trying to avoid the issue of bilingual education at all costs.
Well, what are they saying?
Well, they say that, bilingual education may not work, or we don't want to defend bilingual education, but we think this initiative is the wrong way to go. And really, they're just making up distortions about what the initiative says in order to try to frighten people.
Give an example of a distortion.
Well, I mean, one thing they say, for example, is that the initiative would force schools to mix together children of different ages, which is just utterly false. And another thing they say is that teachers could be sued for speaking another language other than English, which again is just utterly false. In fact, one of the sheets we distribute with our materials, and we also have up on our website, is called Falsehoods and Facts about Proposition 227. And again, the other side in their campaign literature that they give to their supporters urges their supporters to avoid the subject of bilingual education at all costs. In other words, they don't want to defend bilingual education because it's indefensible. It just doesn't work. We've been trying it for 30 years, and it's never worked in all that time.
When will the formal campaign start?
Well, I mean, really, the campaign is going on right now. It's been going on for all this time. It's 2 months before the election.
And will you be doing the usual TV and all of that?
We'll be doing some of it.
That gets expensive, regardless of your comment previously.
We'll be doing some of it, but I really don't think we have to do all that much. In fact, the main focus of our advertising probably will be the Spanish language media. Because right now we're ahead almost 4-to-1 among everybody in California, which is a gigantic lead. While on the other hand, among Hispanics, we're only ahead by 2-to-1. So in other words, there's more of a chance that we could lose ground among Hispanics in California. And since they're the ones most affected by bilingual education, we'll probably concentrate most of our advertising efforts in the Spanish language media.
Let's assume for a moment that you are successful with this venture. What's the next political step for Ron Unz?
Well, I mean, actually, one thing I've come across is a lot of other things that probably should be fixed through the initiative process in California. And maybe I'll get involved in other things like that.
Are you planning to run for office again?
Oh, I might.
And you mentioned the initiative process, and we said off camera that I'm not a big fan of doing government that way. Why not? Are you going to try the legislature first on some of these new ideas?
I really think the legislature never pretty much gets anything done in a typical year. I mean, for example, a lot of these issues hang around for 10 or 20 years, and during all that time, pretty much they all just sit around and talk, and nothing ever gets done.
But doesn't the initiative process, even though it may be valid in this particular example that we were talking about, ultimately just undercut the whole idea of representative government?
Well, I mean, if representative government were more effective, probably people wouldn't turn to the initiative process. But again, in the case of bilingual education, we have a gigantic program that doesn't work, that nobody wants, and that is based on a law which expired 11 years ago.
Well, perhaps I should encourage you to make your next issue, instead of going to another initiative, let's find a way to make government work better the way it's supposed to in the halls of the legislature. But as we wind down the show, I want to thank Mr. Unz for being our guest and for sharing a lot of his ideas with us. If you want information, he has a website, and I understand you even have the opposition's reference on your website, which I think is very magnanimous of you. Nothing you can't do with a large poll lead. But find out about the issue. It is important. It's going to affect the children of California and their future. Do something about it. Next week on Newswatch, the religious right. So we'll have some fun there too. Stay with us and we'll see you next week.
A higher education is made possible in part by a grant from the Ray and Peggy Daba Fund and viewers like you.
The UNS initiative would end bilingual education in California public schools. Children would be required to learn English in one-step English immersion classes. Teachers, parents, and language experts agree it won't work. Could this initiative strike at the core of cultural identity? And more importantly, what will be the impact of this initiative on a higher education? We will discuss this next on A Higher Education. Hello, I'm Claire Mack. Please meet our guests on A Higher Education. With us today is Holly Thier. She is the campaign spokesperson for No on Proposition 227.
Thank you, Claire.
Ron Unz, who is author of the bilingual initiative, Prop 227, and Dr. Olivia Martinez, Vice President of Kenyatta College and former Director of Bilingual Education in Bay Area school districts. Ron, let's begin with you. I'd like your take on what you feel your initiative is.
What our initiative would do would be switch California's system of educating children who don't know English away from bilingual education where they're taught in their native language and more towards intensive sheltered English immersion. So in other words, under our initiative normally, children would be taught English as soon as they start school, which I think is the important.
Nothing more, nothing less. That's it.
Well, they'd be taught other subject matter, obviously, as well. But
That's all your
Okay.
initiative is.
well, I mean, without other things, it actually allocates $50 million to local school districts to fund adult English literacy programs as well. But the main goal of the initiative is to teach English to children as soon as they start school, as quickly as possible.
All right. Holly, what is your take on what Proposition 227 is?
Right. Basically, Proposition 227 is a one-size-fits-all, sink-or-swim, $50 million a year initiative that will take California's 1.4 million school children out of their regular classes, put them in one single classroom, mixing children of all different ages, cultural backgrounds, language abilities, and give them only 1 year, actually only 180 days to learn English. And if the child can't learn English in 180 days, he or she will be transferred into mainstream classes without an opportunity to learn English. You know, we say, what if the child needed 2 years to learn English? On the contrary, what if the child only needed 60 days? Why have a state mandate, a big government state mandate that says you only have 1 year? And Ron Unz brought up a good point. The proposition does appropriate $50 million a year. But reading from the State Attorney General's ballot title summary, it doesn't give it to English literacy programs. It gives it to individuals in the community who pledge to tutor a child in English. There's no accountability on that money. There's no strings attached. It sounds a little bit like the state lottery to me.
Okay, let's put a bookmark on that. We'll come back to that. Dr. Martinez, your take on what it is, what 227 is.
Well, my interest in all this is in student success. And I think to begin with, we need to define what it is we're talking about.
Yes.
Bilingual education is teaching a student in a language they understand while they are learning English, period. Less than a third of all the children in California public schools who are limited English proficient and need special language instruction are even enrolled in bilingual education programs. So I think the point I'm concerned about is we are proposing to mandate dictate to local school boards what they can or cannot do with children that they know best. And for those children who aren't even getting the benefit of bilingual education programs, it would further distance them from the opportunity to engage in programs where they can learn English and not fall behind in their disciplines and their academic subjects, which is what would be the case without a bilingual program.
Ron, immediately, please address the dollar figure and to whom it goes.
Oh, and that's complete nonsense. In fact, my opponent knows it's nonsense. Anybody who reads the text of the initiative, the law we're voting on, sees very clearly the money goes to local school districts to fund adult English literacy programs. I mean, to be honest, the campaign against us refuses to defend bilingual education anyway. In fact, their campaign materials say, avoid the subject of bilingual education at all costs. The reason they refuse to defend bilingual education is the system we have now is utterly indefensible. So instead of defending bilingual education, they try to make up utter falsehoods about our initiative to persuade people to vote against it. The initiative gives the money to local school districts to fund adult English literacy programs, and anybody who reads the text can see that very clearly.
Go right ahead.
Actually, I would like to respond. I was reading directly from what the Attorney General, who is not part of our campaign, Bill Jones, says in his ballot title and summary, and it says, and I quote, that Proposition 227 appropriates $50 million per year for the next 10 years to individuals who pledge to tutor a child in English. Now, what Ron is saying about the adult literacy programs, I think that sounds fantastic, but the truth is that it's not in his initiative and it's not what we'll be voting on June 2nd. And with respect to bilingual education, I think you bring up a good point, Ron. There are very good bilingual education programs out there right now that are working. There are some that need improvement. What we want our children to learn English. And we know that Proposition 227 is not going to do that. There is no research that shows a child can learn English in 1 year in an English immersion program. Now, there will be some examples that people will cite today that say, well, my child was a super achiever and learned English in 30 days. And there are children out there like that. But I think what we saw on March 13th with the State Board of Education's decision is that they realized that districts and teachers need the flexibility to decide how best to teach children. And they said there will not be one state program on how children are taught English. And that's exactly contrary to what Proposition 227 would do should it pass.
With the way the bilingual system is set up now, there is still not one way. There are several components to This is what I wanted to go to in the beginning. Most people don't know what bilingual education is right now.
I'll be glad to clarify that. What we call bilingual education in California is almost entirely, 99% of it, is transitional bilingual education. Under that system, at least for Spanish language students, it amounts to Spanish-only classes. The children are given virtually no English when they start school, generally 30 minutes a day or sometimes an hour a day. All the rest of the time is spent in their native language, which is generally Spanish. And that's the reason that they don't learn English. Now, let me give you some statistics on the current system. These are the official government statistics from the Office of Bilingual Instruction in Sacramento. Today in California, a quarter of all the children in public schools don't know English. And of the ones who don't know English, only 5 or 6% learn English each year. 95% of the children who start a given school year not knowing English end that school year still not knowing English. And these are the official government statistics. The current system we have is a disaster. The only people who support it are the people who make the hundreds of millions of dollars, probably close to $2 billion, going to the current system to pay teachers not to teach children English. And that's the reason we have an opposition campaign.
Dr. Martinez, you have been involved in bilingual education in several school districts.
Yes,
do you know of that type of money being made?
I'm absolutely shocked to hear these allegations from Mr. Unz. I've been in bilingual education all throughout the state of California. I've actually worked in them, seen them, work with the parents. It's simply not true that children are not being taught English. You know, we have a lot of research data that's come out recently that has shown our students, many of them are not learning math like they should. I don't see people putting initiatives to do away with teaching math. We also have a lot of evidence to show that our children need additional help in science. I don't see anyone proposing that we do away with science. I think the issue is we're trying to fix the problem of educating children in the state of California. Legislating and mandating and intruding into the business of school districts as to what they can or cannot do, I think is a larger issue.
Before you go,
I applaud
before,
the recent decision.
But this was the question. Are teachers being paid more not to teach English than those who do teach English?
It's even worse
That's
than that.
not true.
Right now,
It's simply not
under
true.
the current system, schools are paid more money so long as children do not learn English. If a child successfully learns English, the school loses money. And that's the reason they claim it takes a child 10 years to learn English,
Mr.
or
I'd
7
like
years.
to
Those are
respond.
the facts.
I'd like
You're
to
LEP
referring to
respond
the
to
fact
that one.
that school districts are funded according to needs that are identified.
LEP
and the
status.
larger number of LEP students to have, that triggers a certain, just like the poverty index triggers funding, just like the mobility index triggers funding. There are a whole array of program needs that are identified, each of which has a minuscule amount of money, according to schools, that go into offering their programs. That is nothing compared to the expense of a school district having to go out and hire teachers who are trained in bilingually. So saying that it costs more is simply not a valid
In other words, you're
argument.
saying, yes, the schools are paid more money so long as children do not learn English. That is the current
No,
system.
that's
going
Actually,
forward.
That's a
I'd like to
distortion.
respond to a couple things that were brought up here in this wonderful discussion. The first thing is the amount of money that is currently in bilingual education programs will continue in Ron Unz's untested experiment. All the money that's currently spent on bilingual education will go into his one-year immersion program, plus the state will appropriate $50 million more a year in addition for these individuals who pledge to tutor children in English. Now, in addition, he says that our supporters are bilingual educators. We are honored to have support by the California Teachers Association, by the PTA, and also by the League of Women Voters,
And the
which
California School Board
and the
Association.
California School Boards Association.
Administrators
We have every
Association.
major educational organization, and that's because teachers know how to teach children best. And they know that a one-year English immersion sink or swim program, when you mix children of all different ages, all different cultural backgrounds, all different languages spoken, you put them in one class, they're taught English for 1 year only, they fall behind in math and science and all the other subjects that we want our children to learn, is not the way to do it. And I want to also bring up one point that was a good point that you brought up, Ron, the 95% remediation rate, because that's something really important to talk about. That means that only 5% of the children after 1 year move out of bilingual education, which shows why Ron Unz's 1 year only sink or swim program will not work, because children need more than a
Yet
year.
Ron has a story to tell about his background in this country. Do you mind sharing that?
Certainly. I mean, for example, my mother was born in Los Angeles. She grew up not speaking English. She learned a little bit of English before she started school, and then she picked it up very easily and graduated college with a degree in English literature. But I'm not talking about just one story. I'm talking about every other country in the world uses the sort of short-term intensive language program that we're talking about. No other country anywhere in the world uses what we call bilingual education because it doesn't work. Now, either every other country in the world is wrong or we're wrong. And since you yourself have admitted that the current system has an annual failure rate in teaching English of 95%, you
not
can
exactly
see
what I
see
said.
why no other country uses this approach.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to say is that I think we're very lucky here in California and in the United States, because I think we are blessed with the highest educated professionals in the educational establishment. You know, my mother taught public school for over 30 years, and I know the amount of expertise we have in this country is fantastic. It's phenomenal. And we have very good bilingual education programs that work. There is room for improvement.
95% failure rate can be improved.
That is not a 95% failure rate.
I have to
That's
say
the
something.
difference.
There's no other country in this world that has the kind of population that we do. There's no other country
Oh,
that
yes,
has the
there are.
that does not have the
You've got-
equivalent of what we
excuse
have.
me.
And, well, just let me finish.
We should get back to what's on the ballot on June, which is this initiative.
That's correct.
And, you know,
and what it's going to do.
population.
And from
Right.
higher
And what it
education
does.
perspective, I mean, we're trying in higher education to increase the numbers of students that we serve who come from underrepresented populations. In particular, as we look to the future, we need to be sure that we can depend upon this 2 million students who are coming through the system, particularly those who are coming with limited English proficiency skills, that they be adequately prepared to enter the college ranks and to be able to achieve at a level equal or commensurate to those of their native English speakers. That's my interest, and therefore I think it's imperative that we go back to the issue of who knows best how to teach children, and that's the teachers in the schools.
Yet, go ahead,
If I
Ron.
can respond to that point, because higher education obviously is the focus of this topic right now. When we look at students in the public schools in California, most of the students in the public schools who don't know English are Spanish speaking, but actually the others come from 140 different language groups. So in other words, we're talking about students who don't know English, who speak a total of 140 different languages. The only group of students that in large numbers are placed in these allegedly beneficial bilingual education programs where they're taught in their native language are Spanish-speaking students. Pretty much all the other students who don't know English are taught English as soon as they start school in programs very much like what we're proposing. Now, the interesting fact is that of all the immigrant students in California, the Spanish-speaking immigrants who allegedly get the benefits of bilingual education do the worst in school. They have the highest dropout rate, the lowest test scores, and the lowest rate of admission to college. In other words, these are the students who are failing right now. The reason they're failing is they're not being taught to read and write English.
Well, and Proposition 227 is not going to fix that. I mean, I think that's why support in the Latino community has dropped 21 points in the polls from December to February. You know, you're not even at 50% right now in the Latino community. And I think also that, you know, the State Attorney General, Dan Lundgren, just came out and said that Proposition 227 is far too restrictive, that it is a straitjacket on teachers, and after the State Board of Education's decision on March 13th, he didn't see a need for Proposition 227.
If I can clarify that point, you've raised an important point, the State Board of Education's decision. What they did was to say that since the law governing bilingual education in California had expired 11 years ago, they would stop enforcing that law. The only reason they said they would stop enforcing that law is because of the pressure of our initiative. Nothing has changed legally in the last 11 years. There is no law governing bilingual education in California and hasn't been for 11 years. Despite that, the bilingual education industry, which makes hundreds of millions of dollars from this failed government program, has successfully forced all school districts to use bilingual education. We've had a system of mandatory bilingual education in which only 4 school districts, after years of effort and hundreds of thousands of dollars of legal expenses, have won the right to teach children English as soon as they start school.
And right now, the State Board of Education has said that teachers and local school districts need the flexibility. They don't need a one-size-fits-all state-mandated program.
Well,
let me finish.
Sure.
They need the flexibility to decide how to teach the children, and teachers know best. And again, you brought up the money, but all the money that's currently being spent, and I want people to be clear on this, on bilingual education, is going from the current program to your program, and that the independent state legislative analyst says this. It's not coming from my campaign. Plus, you're spending $50 million a year on something, you know, that's going to give money to people who pledge to tutor a child. And in addition, where Proposition 227 has been tried, which is in Westminster County, which is in the Orange County school districts, it has failed. They had to petition to get another year, or I think another 3 years, because children did not learn English in 1 year. So what we're saying is we really want our children to learn English. We both agree on this point, Ron. I know we do. And we sincerely agree, both of us. But we know that Proposition 227 is not the way to do it.
I think also you have to remember that you've got a provision in your initiative that I think would really set many districts on their ear, and that is the provision that allows for lawsuits to be brought forth against school districts.
You've raised a lot of issues.
Okay, let's hold on a minute.
Okay, I'd like to really respond, because you got virtually every fact wrong in what you were saying, unfortunately.
Well, you wrote it.
Excuse me.
So I just read it.
Excuse me. Going through the things, Delane Easton, the state superintendent of schools, has specifically said she will, despite the school board's decision, she will continue enforcing the current law, she says, until the law is changed. The only chance of the law being changed is our initiative. So in other words, Delane Easton says she will continue to enforce statewide mandatory bilingual education until our initiative and if our initiative passes. Second of all, when you say, for example, the school district of Westminster, and it isn't a county, it's a school district, their test scores went down, or they had problems with switching to English immersion program, that's utterly false. Their test scores went up once they started teaching the children English, and that's why other school districts have followed their example.
But
When
why
you
did
talk
they
about,
need more than a year?
Excuse me, when you talk
That's
about
something important, I think,
that's
for
the-
the...
excuse me, going
Well, I
on.
was just asking, I didn't mean to,
No,
you know.
I mean, going on with what we're talking about, again, maybe for some reason, students in California who don't know English require the 7 years to learn English that bilingual advocates say that they do. But students everywhere else in the world learn the national language in generally less than a year. Lots of people I know have come here from other countries. When they come to the United States, they've learned English in just a matter of a few months of their young child. Again, we're talking about a system that's used everywhere else in the world except in California. And when you look at California right now, why are American test scores so much lower, as just came out recently in that study?
Would you explain the study?
Well, the study showed, for example, that American test scores in academic subjects are much lower for students in the United States than in other countries around the world. I think a contributing factor is that we use this failed system of bilingual education, which has never worked anywhere on a large scale anywhere in the United States in 30 years. But the people who make their living from it refuse to let the program die because it, again, is their living. I'd also like to say that finally, in conclusion, our initiative, for example, takes the money that currently is spent not teaching children English and spends that money teaching children English. But once the children learn English, the money no longer has to be spent. And our initiative will therefore save hundreds of millions of dollars a year, which will go to local school districts to be spent on textbooks and smaller class size and all the other things, rather than this failed system of Spanish-only instruction.
I'm getting increasingly uncomfortable with the underlying allegations that somehow it's the Latino population that has to have all these problems. I think you really need to be careful that you're not suggesting that, you know, it's this population of Spanish speakers who somehow continue to raise this failure rate. But more importantly than that, you know, I think that we have to remember that of all the children in the state who need bilingual education, barely a third are in bilingual education programs. The vast majority are not in bilingual education programs. Therefore, it's completely wrong to suggest or allege that 95% of bilingual programs are failing. Secondly, I think it's important, again, in terms of student success, there are many complex reasons that go into the education of children at all ages. And for one sweeping dictum to somehow present itself as being the end-all answer is simply naive and deceitful. And I think the issue goes back to where does control belong in the education of children? It belongs in the hands of the parents and in the hands of the school districts. And I think the issue that you're trying to put forth on the American people is really leading them down a path that would suggest that somehow there's this magical, simplistic solution. If you can really put people in this program for 1 year, it's going to solve all these problems. I can tell you at the college level, we see immigrant students every single day. The ones who have been enrolled in defined programs of bilingual instruction excel because they've learned in the language they best understand, and they've gone on to excel in the second language, English. I've never met an immigrant child or adult who has not wanted to learn English, who has not tried to learn English, and when given the opportunity, has done so.
You've raised a very good point, and that actually is the reason we have such overwhelming support within the Latino community of California. This initiative began when I read a series of articles in Los Angeles Times describing how a group of immigrant Latino parents in downtown Los Angeles actually had to begin a public boycott of their local elementary school because the school was refusing to teach their children English. Latinos overwhelmingly want their children to be taught English, and that is not the case today. What we call bilingual education is Spanish-only instruction, and that's why Latinos are failing.
Ron, do you think some of the animosity that has come about because of this proposition is because you are Caucasian, and that perhaps it should have come, if there was opposition, that it should have come from Spanish-speaking communities, Asian-speaking communities, other language-speaking communities?
To be honest, we have very strong support from Asians, from Hispanics, from all the different groups in California. The honorary chairman of our campaign is Jaime Escalante, probably the nation's most prominent public school teacher. He told me when I met with him that for years he'd been fighting bilingual education. He'd managed to kill it off at his school, and the only reason his students were able to excel, were able to take the Calculus AP exam, which made him famous, was that he'd managed to get rid of bilingual education in the school. Fernando Vega, a local Redwood City resident, he was the member of the local school board in Redwood City who originally established bilingual education here. But he's seen over the years it doesn't work, and then the last straw for him is when they took his own grandchildren, who don't speak a word of Spanish, and they put them in a Spanish-only program because his last name was Vega. And at that point, he made an effort to get rid of bilingual education. All of us are working together to end this failed government program, which ruins the educational future of so many children in California.
All right. I think Ron brought up several points again. First of all, Jaime Escalante is a math teacher. He teaches math to children in English. So he doesn't have the background in bilingual education that I think a lot of the folks that are in opposition to 227 do have. In addition, Ron brings up once again that students, somehow that there's this great support in the Latino community. And the original field poll went out and said, hey, do you want your children to learn English? And everyone wants their children to learn English, and everyone said yes. And as people within the Latino community and within the general community have learned more about what is in Proposition 227, they oppose it. The numbers have gone down. From December to February, the polling has dropped 21 points in the Latino community. It's now at 40-some-odd%, 45%, which is not winning in the Latino community.
We only have about 2 minutes. So
I wanted to say that this Proposition 227 will not fix any of the problems that Ron Unz is addressing. It will not teach children English. All research shows children need more than a year to learn English. It also will appropriate $50 million a year additionally to individuals who pledge to tutor a child in English with no strings attached.
I'd like you to come back and let's just talk on that, but very quickly. I'll give you about 45 seconds, and then I'd like Dr.
What you've said
Martinez.
is utterly false. The question that Latinos were asked is there's a new initiative which proposes that all public school instruction be conducted in English, and that children who aren't fluent in English be placed in short-term English immersion programs. That was the LA Times question. It's the largest survey so far that's been taken of Latinos. It showed 84% of Latinos would support such a policy. And the initiative does not give the money to individuals. It gives it to local school districts. And if you continue fabricating that, you'll discredit yourself completely. It says that in the text of the initiative.
Well, it doesn't say that.
Well, again, I think the important things to remember here are the education of children is what we're talking about, and that's what is at stake. And the general public, every parent of any school-age child knows there are good schools and there are not such good schools. There are effective classrooms and there's classrooms that are not so effective. There are good textbooks, there are not such good textbooks. Fix the problem. Don't erase the whole opportunity.
We'll stop on opportunity. I want to thank you for the opportunity of giving your ideas and so people can study and know what this proposition is all about. Ron Unz, Holly Thayer, Dr. Olivia Martinez, thank you all for being here. Thank you for being here, and please join us again.
The Anti-Bilingual Education Initiative.
This is not an English-only initiative. This is not an English-first initiative. This is English for the children.
Polls show voters will pass the initiative this June. So what does this mean for California's children?
The message is very clear to parents, to teachers, to kids that a foreign language is not healthy.
Today, teachers, administrators, and parents discuss what the future holds for our children, all today on Vista LA.
Hello and welcome to Vista Vista LA. I'm Henry Alfaro.
And I'm Laura Diaz. Today on Vista LA, we will examine the issues surrounding bilingual education and Proposition 227, the initiative that would eliminate bilingual education as it is now practiced in California's public schools.
A controversial initiative indeed that will be on this June ballot, and certainly not an easy one to understand.
Yes, Henry, and it seems like every other day there's a release of another study to prove an opposing side's argument.
But hopefully today, Laura, we will be able to shed some light on this subject. First of all, let's take a look at the initiative and what it really means. It was the boycott of 9th Street Elementary School in Los Angeles over 2 years ago that inspired the Anti-Bilingual Education Initiative in the state of California. Immigrant parents were concerned about their children being taught in Spanish, so they held their kids out of class for 2 weeks, forcing the school to start teaching classes in English.
What our parents understand is that English is the language of access.
This is where former Republican gubernatorial candidate Ron Unz got the idea for Proposition 227, the proposition that would end bilingual education programs in California.
This is not an English-only initiative. This is not an English-first initiative. This is English for the children.
The English for the Children initiative will be on the June ballot. The initiative requires that all children be placed in English language classrooms. Children who are English learners should be placed in sheltered English immersion classes during a temporary transition period not to exceed 1 year. All local schools will place in the same classroom English learners of different ages, but whose degree of English proficiency is about the same. It also includes putting together those students from different native language groups who have the same degree of English fluency. All polls indicate that the initiative will pass. In fact, a recent survey last March showed 70% of the state's voters do support it. While support for the initiative has been mounting, individual school districts are moving to end bilingual instruction. Bilingual teachers say the English for Children campaign is capitalizing on discontent within the public school system and making bilingual education the scapegoat.
Every version of bilingual education has an English language development component. Every single model. Otherwise, it's not a bilingual program.
In March, the State Board of Education decided it had no authority to order local districts to teach children in their primary language. This decision, according to Professor Magali Lavandez, makes the future for children even more uncertain.
We're still very unsure in terms of what are the legal implications of that. We also have several school districts and school boards who have decided to apply for these so-called waivers.
Magali says what concerns bilingual teachers is that the transition for these limited English proficient students into English classes will not be an easy one and may in the end discourage them to learn English altogether.
My fear is for children who are yanked out of supportive, nurturing environments where they can relate and they can understand the content to a classroom where they are confused, where they are not supported, where they feel lost. And when that will happen, it will be disastrous for those students going through this type of program, which is an experiment. It's a costly experiment at the stake of our children, and that's my greatest fear.
Now today we have with us to discuss Proposition 227, Los Angeles Board of Education member Vicky Castro and Alice Callahan, founder and director of Las Familias del Pueblo, a community center that works closely with students from 9th Street Elementary School. Ladies, welcome to Vista LA.
Thank you.
Vicki, let's start out with you. You've been a proponent of bilingual education. It's been around the district for many, many years. Is it working, and why?
I believe that we've come a long way to making it work. When I first became a teacher, anyone who spoke Spanish became a bilingual teacher without methodology training. So I think we've gone through some major revisions of the district. In fact, we wrote the whole plan in 1997. So I think we have moved the notch up considerably, and I would say now it is functionally a lot to still improve. And it almost is on a school-by-school basis, but there are many success stories.
Alice, I know that you don't share that opinion, that you think it is not working. In fact, you've been supporting some of the Latino parents who've been opposed to bilingual education. What exactly do you base that assessment on?
You know, bilingual education, and we have to understand we mean many things by that. So in Los Angeles, what we're really talking about is native language instruction.
where a child is taught only to read and write in their native language for 4 to 7, and now they're recommending 10 years. So it's not bilingualism in the way many people think about it. In fact, our parents at the center often said if it were bilingual education, they would have supported it. Everybody supports bilingualism. The problem is our children were only learning to read and write in Spanish. And like most children, our immigrant children were living in Spanish-speaking homes, playing in Spanish-speaking neighborhoods, watching Spanish-speaking television, and then going to school and studying in Spanish-speaking classrooms. And not surprisingly, they were not transitioning later in life to English. And it's interesting, almost the only immigrant group in California that has what we call native language, transitional bilingual education, are the Latinos. And yet it's the Latinos that have the highest dropout rate at almost 40%. They consistently score the lowest on tests, and they have the fewest numbers of people, students admitted to university. So the one group that is the beneficiary or the victim, however one sees that, of bilingual education in California actually does more poorly than every other immigrant group who does not receive bilingual education.
And I would differ on the statistics. First of all, in California, especially in Los Angeles, we are the largest group, so we have many diverse needs. But in Los Angeles, it is not only the Spanish-speaking children that have bilingual programs. We have a very large Armenian population and Korean population, and we do provide bilingual education settings for them. I think some of the, and I take fault with the district on many issues there because they have not held some standard. When I was a principal, I had 10 elementary schools feed into my junior high school. And the one to the east would have an excellent bilingual program and exited, and I'd have great students. To the north, I'd have a school that did very little. So there was inconsistency in the implementation and the monitoring. I think we have come there's been many improvements. And I support the superintendent's call that says that within 3 years, students should be ready to start exiting. We know there's going to be a few kids that come in with extra educational needs that we hope by the 5th year we could exit. So to say that, from 4 to 10 years, there has been improvement and there has been change in the program. And I'm glad that you qualify. When we say bilingual education, it is not one type of class, one kind of method. We take children where we do a needs assessment on their language ability in their native tongue when they come. Some come from schools from countries that are highly educated and literate, and then we have many children in our district that have never even been afforded the opportunity to attend school, and they're 13, 14, 15. So we're talking about illiterate, and we have to address all their needs.
But Vicki, the argument is that here we live in a country, English is the language. Why should we change everything else? Because I know that I didn't speak any English until I started school, and all of a sudden you learn it, and all children can get immersed pretty quickly.
And I think there's a big difference, though, because I didn't speak English when I entered either, and I had a language problem until college. And so there's many things, but there was no real program that addressed, and if we had supportive families and we had the right environment, somehow we made it. But many of my colleagues did not make it, and my biggest fear now is not that they, won't make it through the seat of their pants, those that have the supportive environments. My fear is that when you're not making it and you don't have the support system, that we'll go back to a system that says you are retarded, you're mentally retarded, and the bilingual program that I came out of put kids in retarded classes and special needs.
Vicki, if I could interrupt for 1 second, we're going to go out on that strong point because we'll be right back with more on Proposition 227 and the future of bilingual education. When we come back, we'll review what reactions parents have had in other parts of Southern California. Please stay with us.
We're here this morning to announce the filing of a lawsuit that's intended to give parents a choice in the education of their children.
That was the reaction from some parents that filed a lawsuit last year against the Orange Unified School District when they decided to eliminate bilingual education. Since then, bilingual education has been phased out of that district. Recently, parents in Santa Barbara had a similar reaction to their school board when it decided to eliminate bilingual ed by the fall of this year. In response to a decision by the Santa Barbara School Board to eliminate bilingual education by the fall of this year, several hundred Latino families last January called a 3-day strike boycotting schools.
It was a 5-0 vote. Very discouraging. No one on that board having the courage to stand up and say, maybe we underestimated the parents, their response, and that's exactly what has happened here.
For 3 days, parents organized an alternative school, sending a clear message to their school board and community at large that there is strong support for the bilingual education program.
This district is saying, you do not have a choice. This is the way it's going to be, and it's going to be applied across the board, okay? And so that's one of the areas that we really need to emphasize over and over: parental choice, parental empowerment. And with respect to this UNS initiative that is facing the voters in June, we're looking at that as an infringement on the powers or the responsibilities of local districts.
But board members insist that this group is just a minority and that the majority of parents in Santa Barbara want to see more English used in their children's curriculum.
I think that the action of the board is opposed primarily by bilingual teachers and a few educators at UCSB. I believe that most of the parents in our district support the action of the board.
Santa Barbara board member Alan Ebenstein says bilingual programs are not working because students are not making the transition to English.
Another measure that we looked at was the percentage of students who are being redesignated from LEP, Limited English Proficient, to FEP, Fluent English Proficient. And prior to this past year, less than 2% of the 2,800 students in our district who were designated LEP were redesignated FEP, which basically means that almost no students were learning English in our bilingual program.
Ruven Ray of the recently formed Santa Barbara Parents Coalition says the English immersion classroom doesn't work either. He was a product of it and still carries the scars of attending school before bilingual programs existed.
I brought a language that I spoke with an accent early on. The message to young kids is that what you bring to the classroom is negative. It's a negative. It's holding you down. That has tremendous impacts on kids' self-concept, self-worth, their own self-esteem. It's not just about eliminating the language. It's affecting the kids' self-esteem. And so by eliminating these programs, you're saying what you're bringing to the classroom is not good. You know, leave it out, put it out.
Joining us on the bilingual education discussion this segment is Henry Gradias with Yes on 227. He's been involved in education for the last 30 years. Also with us is Principal Mara Bomarita of Woodline Elementary School in Bell. Woodline Elementary School has 1,400 students, of which 1,000 are limited in English. The school is 98% Latino. And we'd like to start with you, Mara. Do you think that bilingual education is working? And if so, can you make a case for it?
I know that it's working. At my school, we have a very successful program, and I have the hard data to show anyone that is interested. It is a program at my school that works. There are only 5% of parents at my school that opt out of the program. There is choice for parents. And
why is it working?
It is working because, first of all, we have qualified teachers who are highly trained. It is working because the goal of bilingual education is academic proficiency in English, not just conversational English. Those are two very different things. Beginning at kindergarten, and by the way, 65% of all LEP students are in kindergarten. And so when the children come to school, we begin immediately with English, what we call sheltered English, making them understand, giving them what we call comprehensible input, and so on through the grades. The children begin to read English at about the 3rd grade level. Many of the children begin earlier than that.
When do you wean them out of that program, though?
We just graduated last night 94 children who are 4th grade students and 5th grade students. They are no longer limited English proficient children. Redesignation means one of the criteria is that they have taken a standardized test in English and scored at the 36th percentile. I want to let you know that at my school, the children who are in the bilingual program are scoring higher on the English test than 2 other groups. One, the group whose parents chose not to put them in the bilingual program, and 2, the children who are native English speakers. By 5th grade, the children in the bilingual program are scoring higher. Furthermore, this continues throughout middle school in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and I have the data to show that.
There's actually even longitudinal study within the district that shows that that's more of a pattern than there is failure. Those that come from quality bilingual program will outscore English speakers, native English speakers, and many times on standardized tests.
Although it's interesting, there was actually a study just released by the school board very recently, of which they looked at 7,200 children, 1,400,000 children, who were unusual children in that they went to the same school from kindergarten all the way through 5th grade. So we're talking about a very unusual group of children. Out of those 14,000 students, 7,200 of them were limited English proficient students. Of the 7,200, and these are children in 5th grade, 3,000 of the children in the bilingual program could not be tested in 5th grade in English because they were still not sufficiently proficient in English.
Henry?
See, what I found is far too often these kids that are learning subject matter content in Spanish continue to learn it without ever really shifting into the English version of this, to the point that many are actually held back academically. And when they get to junior high or middle school, when they're tested, obviously they don't do as well as they should. So they're being put into remedial programs, they're being given basic maths, so that for the 3 or 4 years they're in junior high, they just don't progress at the level they should.
You know, Henry, that has changed a lot.
Well,
that has absolutely changed
But the biggest problem I see is when you get them to high school, the counselors there again will test, and if they find that these kids do not have sufficient skills in English, they are forever banned from taking the algebra and geometry that is so quickly and important to be able to take on the physics and the chemistry. So you end up with a very small percentage going on to universities. And unless they really learn the English well enough...
And if you go back to the graduating seniors of kids, such as Garfa, where you were principal, and Roosevelt and other schools, and you look at those that are going to the major universities, those that are the valedictorians of their class, they're out of bilingual programs. And I'm very proud of them because their language was not stripped from them. They're proficient bilingual in both languages, and they are the prize of the community.
We don't want to strip their bilingual heritage or their bilingual language. We want them to keep their Spanish, and that's why we have the AP classes and the classes in Spanish. That's not the problem. Far too many of these students don't learn sufficient English to be able to master the classes in English. Let me give you an example. When I taught, I was brought over by Dr. Aviles back in '72, and later again I became principal 10 years later. But kids would come in with bilingual biology, and the universities would not accept that as a laboratory practical work, so the students that knew it in Spanish had to take another course again in English to be able to master it sufficiently well enough to move on.
Henry, I know you're passionate about this, but I have to cut in for 1 second. We're going to take a short break, but don't go away. We're going to continue our discussion on bilingual education and Prop 227.
Gradual. It'll be easier on the children if it's gradual, because then they'll have some time easing into the new language, getting used to the new language, both hearing it from us as well as the new materials coming in English, versus a sudden switch over and the shock.
Welcome back to Vista LA as we continue our discussion on amount of time is appropriate to be in bilingual ed.
Well, if they really mean bilingual ed and the kids come here already well-versed in their native language, let's say in Spanish, then to be truly bilingual, classes should be taught in English and subject matter material must be in English. And I feel that when kids come in, particularly if they've been educated in their country to the level that they come in here, it's easy for 1 year
when you take
for them to move
you're
to
talking
that
about
particular.
high school, not elementary
I'm
school,
talking
where
about,
most of the left students are in elementary. I think that I have
also we agree a literate child
in
in
the
their
elementary
language can
level.
move out of a program in
In 1 year.
2 years,
1 year
3
is
years.
sufficient.
You know, I mean, to master English too
Why
is what we're
waste
talking.
time?
No
When
one's
I taught-
wasting time.
when I taught
but you know
bilingual
what? The
biology,
majority of
the
the
kids
children
weren't-
coming here are not that literate child that you're
But you
talking
have
about.
quite a few
we
that
have
are.
quite a few,
We're
and
talking
we're
about
addressing their
five-year-old
needs.
children
But we're talking
who are
about the
coming
majority.
with no background in literacy.
But why teach them math in Spanish? Math is international. 4 and 4 are 8. Cuatro y cuatro.
No, it's not
And if
just
they learn this-
computation. We're talking
But
about application
know
of
what the UNS
mathematics.
initiative does
that
not
involves language.
Listen, they not only learn the subject
UNS
matter
initiative
content,
does
they
not
also
even
learn the
address
English.
content area, and it doesn't even care if they take a class in
I want to
content
talk about
areas.
the classroom
So
that will
talk
be
about
created
English
at the
only, and
elementary
it's almost
school.
a year of stopping any growth in math and science and social studies. If the UNS initiative is passed, it talks about total immersion in English for 1 year,
And you will have a
do not
classroom with a first
worry
grader,
about
second
their
grader,
math,
third
do
grader,
not
fourth grader,
worry
and a
about their
fifth
social
grader.
studies.
What does that
It
do
will
for
hold,
academic
it's
learning?
1 year of
If a child
remedial.
can't understand the language, how can you teach them?
Let's talk about how that works. We actually have first graders and kindergartners at our center, and they're all in English language classes. They don't even have the benefit of what the initiative is proposing, which is an intensive language class. You have to understand, no other country on the face of the earth does what we do here, which is first teach a child to read and write in their native language.
And this is like no other nation on the face of the earth
because
that
it doesn't
has
work.
a responsibility to educate every child in its public education. There are countries in this world that you know that it's a elitist local educational system, and I don't think we are in that category.
Very opposing views. We run out of time. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Kids probably up on the vilest, most vulgar terms. Their notions of there's no confidence.
Jews perhaps have a higher degree of sensitivity.
This constitutes supplanting
Your wish, not keep it.
I think it's our intention and our welcome that anyone who wants to come and worship.
In June, California voters will go to the polls to decide the future of bilingual education, once again putting the Golden State at the center of a growing national controversy. Should children learn in their native languages while acquiring English skills? Or is immersion in English the best way to give students the skills they will need to succeed? Good evening. Welcome to Beyond the Headlines. I'm Kathy Mendelson-Siegel. Joining me this evening are Ramona Ripston, Executive Director of the ACLU in Southern California, Sherry Annis, spokesperson for the English for the Children campaign, Holly Thier, campaign spokesperson for the No on 227 campaign, in fact, the same initiative campaign, and Dr. Hanan Alexander, Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the School of Education at the University of Judaism. Welcome, everyone. I want to begin with you, Hanan. When we talk about bilingual education, what are we talking about?
We're talking about teaching in a target language of instruction.
Target language being?
Target language meaning the language that you want the students to acquire. So, for example, if we're looking at children that are native in Spanish and we want to teach them in Spanish as opposed to teaching them in English, or teaching children that if we want them to acquire English, teaching them in English. So not only are we teaching them English language, but we're also teaching them mathematics in English and other subject matters in English as well, so that the language of instruction is actually the language that we want the students to acquire.
So in a bilingual setting, we're teaching the Spanish-speaking child math in English?
In a bilingual setting, we could be teaching the Spanish-speaking child's math in English or in Spanish, depending on which language we thought was more sufficient. In the policy issue, for the most part, bilingual education in California has meant that we teach Spanish-speaking children in Spanish primarily so that they can acquire the skills that they need to acquire in mathematics, and then secondarily in English. And the debate, I think, that we're having is which is the better way for those young people to acquire those skills. Should they acquire the skills by teaching them in Spanish, which is the language they speak at home, or should we help them to acquire mathematical skills and other kinds of skills by teaching them in English, so that they, at the same time that they're acquiring those skills that they will need to succeed, they're also acquiring the English language?
So it's fair to say that when we talk about bilingual education, what we're not talking about is teaching English as a second language to students who were born and learned to speak a first language other than English. What we're talking about is other academic skills and what language we teach those in.
That's correct. We're teaching second language acquisition through some form of immersion.
Ramona, in your experience, how successful are we in California in terms of using bilingual education?
Well, a good bilingual education program should teach children English, if that's what they are desirous of learning, and at the same time keep them up to their grade level in subject matter. So that may mean that they should be taught subjects that they need to keep up to their grade level in a language they're familiar with, at the same time learning English. I think that California has probably not done a good job. First of all, the programs have been underfunded. There are 1.3 million children in Los Angeles whose native language is something other than English, and only 30% of them are in bilingual education classes. There is a profound shortage of teachers who can truly teach bilingual education. So I'm not here to defend bilingual education. I think if it's done well, it's probably a good idea. I'm here to talk about why this particular initiative will not do what it's cracked up to do.
Well, we're going to talk about the initiative, which in California from time to time is affectionately referred to as the UNS Initiative, after Ron Unz, who is its author. But before we get to talking specifically about the UNS Initiative, Sherry, I want to ask you a question. Where does this movement to do away with the current form of bilingual education in California come from?
Okay, a couple places. I just want to address real quickly what I believe what bilingual instruction has become in California, which is different throughout the United States. In California, bilingual education is generally native language instruction. So like you were saying, children who are immigrants or who were born here and have surnames or speak one language in the home are taught in their native language for between 5 and 7 years before being transitioned onto English. And that was the problem that was brought to our attention over a year ago, actually February of '96. There was a Latino boycott in downtown Los Angeles. A group of Latino parents boycotted their school until the administration agreed that their children could learn English. They had fought and asked, and the administration said absolutely not. You will be in bilingual programs learning Spanish. Frankly, the reason is because they receive extra funding for each child who remains in a bilingual program or who is not reclassified as English proficient.
So from the perspective of the campaign and the initiative to change the nature of bilingual education in California, the moving factor was a group of unhappy parents who felt that their kids weren't being given English language tools.
Correct.
I have got to let you respond to that, Holly, because you are the spokesperson for the No on 227 campaign, which is, of course, the same initiative that Sherry is a spokesperson in support of, and ask where you see the problem with the initiative that is before the California voters, generally, as opposed to taking each paragraph.
Certainly. There's several major problems. The first is that it's a $50 million a year big government spending program.
An amazing statement, right?
Yeah, I mean, what this proposition will do is it's going to take California's 1.38 million children out of their classroom, put them in one classroom for only 180 days.
Absolutely.
Well, hold on. Let's be sure that our listeners understand that we're not talking about putting 1.3 million kids all together in one large stadium for the year. That's not where you're headed.
No, not one classroom, but it's going to take children of all different ages, all different cultural backgrounds, all different languages spoken, and the proposition does allow those children to be mixed in one classroom. It's going to give them only 180 days, 1 year.
One school year.
Right, one school year, and it's a sink or swim program. If they don't learn enough English in that year, they're out of the classroom, and they go into their mainstream classroom without getting a chance to acquire enough English to compete successfully.
So some of them will and some of them won't.
Well, all research shows that children do not pick it up within 180 days.
Do not pick up a second language.
English. It normally takes 3 to 7 years, basically, for them to pick it up. In addition, what the proposition does is it appropriates an additional $50 million a year that's taken out of the classroom, out of the schools, and given to adults who pledge to tutor a child in English.
So we're using a private sector model, in essence, to provide additional tutoring instruction. That sounds a little bit like something that happens on in Israel, where the Israeli government provides additional resources to children who are immigrant children when they move from the Ulpan program, the Israel form of language immersion, into the school system. Is it very different?
Well, the Israeli program provides essentially a year of instruction to the immigrant child. And I think the research is correct that a year of instruction is probably not sufficient to enable a student to be sufficiently proficient in the language in order to be completely successful. One of the difficulties here is defining just how proficient the student has to be. And of course, we know that many people have differences of ability, so that some children will pick it up more rapidly than other children.
And some people will never entirely pick it up.
Well, that's true, although if you're dealing with children, that's probably less accurate, as the curve goes down very rapidly as the child grows, so that the younger child can learn the language much more easily rapidly than the child that's older. Say a 3 or a 4 or a 7-year-old child is going to have a much easier time acquiring the language than a 13 or a 14 or a 15-year-old child. But I did want to comment on the question of the 5 to 7 years, because the 5 to 7 year time span is a pretty long time span. For the most part,
Actually, I said 3 to 7.
well, 3 to 7 is still a pretty, the 7 is a pretty long time span, I think, for most years. The total immigrant experience in Israel takes usually about 5 years to feel as though people feel more or less at home in the new culture. But children after, I mean, between the first year and the third year, somewhere in that time frame, are able to participate normally in school life. What Israel does in addition is they provide what sometimes is called in English a shadow teacher program. That is to say, they have additional support to some students who need additional skills and additional support, translation and other kinds of things in the form of tutorials, and they do this through a variety of different mechanisms funded by the Army and funded by the government and the Ministry of Absorption.
What we're doing here in California is changing the way children are taught English. Rather than waiting until the later years where we believe it's more difficult to acquire a new language, we want to introduce children to the English language as soon as they enter school through English immersion. When English immersion is used, it's designed to take 1 year. Our initiative in particular says not normally to exceed 1 year because there are exceptions and some children will always fall behind, and so you want to make allowances for that. But English immersion is designed to introduce the child to the English language as soon as possible so that they can then be mainstreamed, so they won't be segregated for between 3 and 7 years, so that they can compete in an English language classroom.
Ramona, what bothers you the most about the initiative?
Well, several things. First of all, Sherry's definition of what bilingual education is wrong. She would make you believe that children entering California schools who are not proficient in English are taught solely in their native language.
They get about a half hour of English per day.
That is totally untrue. It is up to individual school districts to decide how children who are not fluent in English are to be taught.
But you would certainly agree, Ramona, that there are many instances where there are children who are being taught predominantly in their native language.
I'm not familiar with every bilingual program in this state. I am familiar with some. I'm familiar with some that have worked, and I'm familiar with many that have not.
I'm not talking about working or not
But let me just tell you about this initiative. But I want to dispel this notion that what we do is to put children in school and teach them in Spanish or Vietnamese or Chinese or Japanese. That is not what we're doing, Sherry. Well, you may say that. This initiative is, as Holly said, a sink or swim initiative. After 180 days or 1 school year, you don't get any further help as they do in Israel. It's either you do it or you don't do it. If you don't do it in 180 days, you get no further instruction in your native language.
So
furthermore, this $50 million, which Holly talked about, is given to anybody who comes along. There are no standards for people.
The local school board distributes
who comes
the money.
along.
That's not what the initiative
And
says.
that's not what the initiative says. No,
says.
I have it. I can read it to
And
you.
you're also
I have it.
You're also incorrect that
Well,
kids will
wait a
be
minute. Will
placed
you
in
let me
all
finish,
different
and then
ages in
I'll
one
let
big
you
classroom.
finish?
Okay, go
I
ahead,
was
go ahead.
talking.
That's fine. Go ahead, and I'd
Kathy
like to
asked me to finish.
respond.
$50 million given to people who come along and say, I want to tutor children in their native language. There are no standards whatsoever.
We're going to have a disagreement about the characterization of that $50 million, and I'm going to let Sherry jump in, but I can't leave something that you said, Ramona, totally unchallenged. You suggested that although you acknowledge you don't know about every bilingual program in the state, and there are many, and it's important to know that this is a decentralized operation in California and in most other states as well, where there isn't a state statute which then everybody follows in lockstep. You said that they've
would change.
You've said that there is really to the best of your knowledge, no teaching of children solely in Spanish, and I'm going to tell you that I can think of 3 cases for a fact where that's not true. So my guess is that the experience in California, and probably the experience in other states with large immigrant, non-English, native-speaking populations, is that we're going to find some of everything.
Well, that may be true, Kathy, and I won't disagree with that.
And we need to just acknowledge that one of the reasons that this issue has gotten so hot and bothered is that there is a great deal of unevenness in terms of how all of these programs are applied. But you wanted to pop in with something.
I think it's important to understand the beginnings of bilingual education, that it was begun with very good intentions. In other words, children were placed in sink or swim situations. They were thrown into a mainstream English classroom without any extra assistance. And there needed to be a change. What we do now and what is required by law is that you do give children extra assistance in acquiring the English language. The question is how you give that assistance and for how long you give that assistance. So English immersion is different than submersion. Submersion means that you automatically place the child in a mainstream English language classroom. English immersion means that you give the child extra assistance in acquiring the English language. And that's through a lot of visuals, a lot of repetition. You can use the child's native language here and there to help them understand the English language, but basically it's primarily taught in English so that the child hears it around them all the time, and that's the quickest and best way for them to acquire the English language.
Fire away, Holly.
I'd like to respond to that. Actually, under Proposition 227, it says that if a teacher speaks in any language other than English, the teacher can be sued.
It absolutely does not say
Could I
that.
please finish?
I'd like you to show me where it says that.
I will show you. It's in section 3.05. And it's the proposition.
What the initiative says is that if you do not provide the child with an English language education, if you willfully and repeatedly do not provide that, then you can be held liable.
I think that what we're seeing is a certain amount of spinning on both sides, but why don't you finish? Actually,
Again,
I think we're seeing a lot of spinning.
I would like to finish. That is exactly what the proposition says. It also says, and I have in front of me the official title and summary that's going to be on the ballot prepared by the Attorney General here in California. This is not
I would prefer you not read the whole thing, or we'll not have time for any
comments.
comments.
This is not a campaign document. It says, quote, Proposition 227 appropriates $50 million per year for 10 years funding English instruction for individuals pledging to tutor a child in English. So this is clear that the money is going to individuals, not to school districts. We see that as a bad thing. It's going away from the schools, outside, away from children. We don't think that's going to teach children English.
Well, not necessarily away from children, if in fact the tutoring services were provided.
The core issue here.
We also,
fire away.
Isn't the core issue intuitively, if you have an immigrant child, is it better to teach the immigrant child in English, or is it better to teach the immigrant child in their native language? Right. It seems to me intuitively, if we want the child to acquire English, you don't have to have a lot of research to say, teach the child English. And if you continue to teach the child Spanish or Vietnamese or Chinese, and they get Spanish, Vietnamese, and Chinese in school, and they get it at home, they're going to be much more slow to acquire English. It seems to me it's just sort of common sense to say that if you want to teach a person English, teach them in English.
Well, I want to take that back to a sort of an interesting question, which we were all discussing before the show. We have such a different view in 1998 of language for immigrant children than we had in 1915 or 1920, when there were huge waves of immigration to the United States, largely non-English speaking people. What has changed? Tanan, what's changed?
Well, I mean, in the early part of the century, America had what one scholar called sort of a one best system approach to education. There was one model. It was a primarily Anglo model. It was an English-speaking Protestant model, and basically everybody had to fit into that system. I don't think that anybody is arguing here that we need to go back to the one best system approach to education. We have gone past that. There's no question about it. We are a multicultural society. We believe that we have to honor and value the cultures of a whole variety of different peoples, both that live here and that are raised here and that come here from other shores. So we're not advocating a one best system approach by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, that one best system approach, we have a whole lot of evidence that says that it just didn't work. A lot of immigrants succeeded, but oftentimes they succeeded despite the educational system and not because of it. What we're simply saying, and I think it's basically, I go back to the basic intuitive, which is if I want to teach a kid math, I should offer hours of instruction in math. If I want to teach a kid science, I should offer hours of instruction in science. And so too, if I want to teach a kid English, to offer them hours of instruction in Spanish doesn't seem to make much sense. I should teach them English.
Well, I don't think we disagree about that. I mean, I think one of the problems with this initiative, with what's going on here in California, is that it will become the law of this state, that it will be impossible to change. You know, initiatives like Proposition 13 changed California, which was the property tax initiative, destroyed the school system here in California. And we had a wonderful school system. We were the tops in the country here in California. Proposition 13 changed all that. This initiative, this one-year English language immersion of 180 days, will be there permanently. It could not be changed because it will be a constitutional amendment, and it will mean that 2/3 of the legislature...
It's not a constitutional amendment, it just requires a supermajority from the legislature
to change it, and it also means the governor would have to sign it. It never happens. It will not be changed. It is an untested measure. Bilingual education needs to be reformed, but this is not a way to do it. Nobody knows whether this one-year immersion program will work.
And where it has been tried, this one-year immersion program has been tried in Westminster School District here in Orange County. That's near Los Angeles for the people out of state. Where it was tried, it failed. They had to petition the State Board of Education to get more time. They needed more time because the children did not learn English in 1 year. And you know, one of the things that you said, talking about learning another language, I remember as a young girl in Hebrew school, I remember trying to learn the Hebrew alphabet. And I remember that
a daunting task.
Yes, a very daunting task. And to this day, I still know the regular one. I don't know cursive yet, but anyway, someday I'll learn that. But it was so helpful to have someone who could tell me Aleph means A, because I knew what A meant. And another thing that's going to happen with Proposition 227 is that these children, they're going to fall behind in every other subject. They're
and we don't know that, do we?
Yes, we do.
How?
We do not know.
They're
how do we
only
know
going
that?
to be
How do we
taught-
know it? How do we know it,
It says
Polly?
it right in the initiative.
No. How do we know that they're going to fall behind?
Because they'll be taught English for 180 days. They're going to mix up 5-year-olds
So
and
it's a syllogism
13-year-olds.
from your perspective. If A, then B always.
No, it's not a syllogism. They're going to be taught English for 1 year.
Right.
Now, there are other subjects they're not going to be
you
taught.
continue with math and you continue with science.
Well,
Our co-chair's
actually,
been
it
teaching it for
doesn't
15
say
years.
that in the initiative.
That's what English immersion
And all we
is.
can go by is what's in the initiative, and they say they're
So
going
it
to
strikes me that one of the things that's going to happen out of this may be good for California, separate and apart from the issue of bilingual education, which is the whole discussion of the initiative process. Having nothing to do with the merits of this particular initiative, but the fact that the conversation now focuses around what is read between the lines and what is on the lines of this particular initiative, and the issue of the supermajority and how a legislature would undo the act of the people should it wish to, and maybe rethinking public policy by initiative.
Yes,
but actually,
I think that that's a very good idea.
But I'd like to go back to what Holly said about how she learned Hebrew, because I think that's really a case in point. Now, Holly, do you speak Hebrew today?
I do speak some, but not.
But do you consider yourself to be really proficient from your Hebrew school education?
I didn't study Hebrew.
Okay, because for the most part,
as a
I think
second
that the most of our viewing audience, I think, that attended Hebrew schools would probably say that they're not especially proficient.
Forget Hebrew school. Anybody who took an academic second language but didn't speak it regularly is probably not proficient.
But let's, I mean, I took French in high school, okay? Now, I would say that I learned a lot more French in high school than I learned Hebrew, and I went to Hebrew school as well. Now, the point is, I took French, and my teacher spoke to me in French. Right. She used French as the language of instruction. I took Hebrew in Hebrew school, and my Hebrew school teacher spoke to me in English and tried to teach me Hebrew.
When she wasn't trying to grab the paper airplanes out of the
That's
air.
right, or the chocolate
That's what
fire.
happened
Okay, but the point is, that what I'm trying to suggest, in fact, that your example it proves the opposite of the case. Because, in fact, we have not applied an American supplemental, that is, an American synagogue education in our Hebrew schools. We have not applied what we know about second language acquisition. What we know about second language acquisition is that you have to put a youngster in an immersion experience in order to be able to acquire the language. And in fact, the best way to explain to a young person Aleph, if you want them to know Hebrew, is not to tell them that Aleph is A, because in fact Aleph is not A. Aleph is a silent letter. So you have to explain to them in Hebrew what Aleph is so that they can understand what it is in the context of that language. And that actually is what we know about second language acquisition all the way across the board.
I think this brings up a really good point, which is that every child learns different. And for me, that worked in Hebrew school. And I did learn Hebrew that way. And I think that that's what we're saying, that Proposition 227, that is a one-size-fits-all program that takes, now the State Board of Education here in California just recently decided to let local school districts have the flexibility to decide how best to teach children English. Now, Proposition 227 will take all of that away, will mandate one program that, as Ramona said, cannot be changed except by a 2/3 vote of the legislature, governor's signature, or by another initiative. And there aren't many wealthy millionaires like Ron Unz, who, you know, admits he's never stepped foot into a bilingual education classroom, that can put something on the ballot like this.
Yeah, but to say that all children learn differently is to say that, no, we can learn nothing from research about the way in which people acquire language. Right. We do know from a huge body of research that the vast majority of children acquire language, any language, better in an immersion experience. And that's just basically intuitive. It's a fundamental time-on-task idea. If you're in a place where they use the language, you're going to be more likely to acquire it.
Right,
let me just finish this point. And to say that a person learns differently is not, that means in the context of an immersion experience, I'm going to need to address one child through a variety of visual apparatuses and another child through a variety of verbal apparatuses. Some of them are going to learn better orally, some of them are going to learn a little faster, some of them a little slower. But the fundamental proposition that if I want to teach Hebrew, I should use Hebrew, or if I want to teach Spanish, I should use Spanish, I think that the research is pretty clear that in the vast majority of cases, that's simply the best way to teach it.
Ramona, if you were to be able to make a compelling one-sentence argument to people about what is fundamentally wrong with this approach to bilingualism in California, and a concern that many people have is that, of course, if it goes here, it'll go across the country because we've seen similar effects. What would that be? What's the thing about this initiative which makes you the craziest from a fairness perspective?
I think two things. I think that it's untested, untried. That
so
nobody
a pilot
knows
program would have been a better approach.
Well, something that is not an initiative.
On that note, we unfortunately are out of time, which is not fair when you're dealing with such a complicated subject, but it is the way it is. So I want to thank our guests, Ramona Ribson, Holly Thayer, Jerry Annis, and Hanan Alexander. And thank all of you. Please join us next time when once again we go beyond the headlines.
Welcome to another edition of Media One-on-One. I'm Perry Parks, your host. We continue today with our series Election Campaign 98 with one of the most important and much talked about initiatives on this year's ballot, Proposition 227, the Bilingual Education Initiative. In a short capsule, the measurement calls for public school instruction to be in English. It provides for an initial short-term placement not normally to exceed 1 year. And intensive English immersion programs for non-English speaking children. It appropriates $50 million per year for up to 10 years for English instruction to non-English speaking adults who pledge to tutor immigrant children in their communities. And it also permits enforcement suits by parents. With us is a distinguished panel of guests to help us shed some light and insight on this proposition from both sides and from for and against the initiative. Jose Delgadillo is a teacher on leave while he serves as a spokesperson for UTLA, UTLA, the United Teachers of Los Angeles, who are against Proposition 227. Our next guest is Maribel Medina, staff attorney for MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, also against 227. And our third guest is Henry Gardias, past principal of Garfield High School, now representing English for the Children, who supports the initiative. I urge you to participate in today's program. Call in your questions and talk back live with our guests. The call-in number is area code 310-216-3590. Again, that's area code 310-216-3590. Before we open our discussion with our panel, I'd like to share an interview with you that I recently did in Washington, D.C. with Congressman Xavier Becerra. In my discussion with the Congressman, I asked him to give us a capsule overview of what Proposition 227 is and to talk to us about some of the inner workings of it and what really is at stake with the Bilingual Education Initiative.
In that 10-second soundbite, Proposition 227, the UNS initiative, would eliminate what we call bilingual education. And bilingual education can take many forms. It's not just giving kids who don't speak English well instruction in their native language. It's all sorts of different types of learning tools that are used. But the UNS initiative would kill that and say, let's use this one approach, and only this one approach of 1 year of study for that child in English, and then put them into a classroom where it's all English, and hope that all these kids, age 5, age 10, all put together in the same classroom would have to learn.
Well, let's see if we can explore that soundbite a little bit, Xavier. What is the current model that we're working in terms of bilingual education, which is a lot broader, I'm thinking?
There's no one model. There is one premise. A child who does not have a facility in English or any other language can learn that language and other material, other subjects, best if transitioned into that main language. What we have right now, for example, is a situation where a child may know a little bit of English, but not enough to know the technical aspects of the language. So what you do is you help that child with the native language, and over the course of maybe 2-3 years or so, you transition the child. And at the same time the child is learning English, the child's also had a chance to learn geography, science, math, so that when the child does transition into English, the child hasn't all of a sudden also fallen behind on science, math, geography. Other tools that are used are what are called the full immersion program, where you actually immerse them completely in an English instruction classroom. But you give them a lot of attention, because obviously they're not understanding a lot of what's being said early on. And that usually runs you a few years as well, because what you're doing is you're totally consuming the child in English, but you're being attentive because you know the child is not capturing quite a bit of what's being said, at least early on.
So it looks like then from a time point of view, you're talking about a multiple year program, maybe 3 or 4 versus 1, just in terms of time.
It could be 1 year for a child who's got some grasp of English, or it's a quick study. It could be 4 years for others. A lot depends not on the child, but on the teacher. If we don't have a teacher who can teach that language, you're going to have a problem.
All right, so then let's talk a little bit about how effective that program has been over the years. How effective has the traditional program been over the years?
Well, you're going to run into people saying it's been totally ineffective, and some who say it's totally effective.
But you said the premise.
Right, the premise.
So let's talk about how effective the premise has been then, because I think there are room.
The experts will tell you, those who study language acquisition will tell you the premise is sound. Yo te puedo hablar en español en este momento y tú tal vez me vas a comprender. I don't know if you caught anything what I just said.
Something about understanding. That's about all I got right.
Well, that's what you throw a 5 or 6 or an 8-year-old into. Now, you're an adult. You can probably handle the emotions of that, the psychosis of that.
Barely.
Now think of a 7-year-old child. What kind of trauma does that cause? What you try to do is say to the child, I'm going to transition you so that what I just said, you'll understand completely, and I'm going to say it in English. But I don't want you, while you're focusing so much on trying to learn English, to forget that you have to also learn math and science and geography. Bilingual education says, let's do that transition as quickly as possible, so that child within 3 years or so, 2 years, maybe 4 years, will be in a totally English-only environment and succeeding along with his or her peers.
So then, so the premise is working, and we have results, I would assume, in terms of numbers that are educated and have made that transition that we can point to as well. Are you familiar with any of those?
Sure. You can point to particular schools that have very good success rates with their children. You can also point to other schools that don't have a good success rate, and that's been the problem. You can point to some of those schools where the kids aren't learning quickly enough, aren't capturing not just the English, but also not enough math or science. And we see it becoming a trip or a path to nowhere for these children. And that's what's caused, I think, so much of this fervor to eliminate bilingual ed. But unfortunately, as we were discussing before we came on the air, do you want to throw the baby out with the bathwater? Do you really want a system for about 1.5 million children in California, of the 6 million or so children in California who are in school, where those children will get 1 year of intensive English, and after that 1 year, it's sink or swim. You now have to go into the mainstream classroom. My problem with that is, does that child learn quickly enough with the rest of his or her peers, or does the teacher say, I've got to slow down the classroom so I don't lose this child? One way or the other, the teacher has to make a decision.
Well, there are a couple of things that seem to come to me. It seems to me that you're going to lose some anyway, because out of 100 kids, you're not going to get 100 that are going to move at the same pace.
Right.
So are there implications for increased dropout and then increased other social problems that are attendant to people that are dropping out of school? What is the
I'd say yes.
prognosis on that?
I'd say yes. We could take off our jackets right now, and yours would not fit me, and mine would not fit you. But the UNS initiative says this method of teaching has to fit every child in the state. Not just those who are limited English proficient, but every child. Because remember, those kids who are limited English proficient get thrown into the regular classroom after 1 year. Everything has to fit every child the same way. If it's too big or too small for you, tough luck, because by law we will require that they all be in the same classroom.
So it seems to me that you're pointing to the fact that this isn't a policy issue, which an initiative is designed to create or fashion, that this is more akin to a management or implementation issue, maybe at specific sites, because you said that there are sites that are working, there are sites that aren't. Has anyone really spoken to that particular aspect of the issue?
I believe you're beginning to see folks try to really be more surgical in their approach. It's the mechanics, you're right. It's not the substance, the policy behind the premise of bilingual education. It's the mechanics, how it's implemented. And what you're finding more and more in the recent action by the state school board to try to allow local school districts to have more decision-making about how they implement programs for bilingual ed. All of that's to say, let people at the heart of the issue, those who are actually teaching day-to-day at that site, decide how best to do it. Now, there's a concern that some sites will say, well, we don't need anything, and we won't really pay attention to these children. But I think more and more, because of the attention that bilingual education is getting, I think you'll find that local school districts and the schools will really be attentive to how to best serve that child's needs.
Now, you've devoted a lot of time to this issue, Javier, and it seems to be a decidedly local issue. You're in a position in Congress where you're dealing with national policy. Why the attention to this particular issue, other than, then you're from Los Angeles and California, but in your position as a congressman, national policy is kind of the scope. Why the attention to such a local issue?
Remember that what happens in California, sooner or later will happen throughout the rest of the nation. That's one thing about California. We are a leader in so many different ways. We are the bellwether in so many different issues. So whatever we do in California, chances are, at some point, it'll ripple all the way through the country. Secondly, I can take you, we can leave right now, take off these mics, and travel no more than 5 or 7 miles, and I'll show you a bilingual education school here in Washington, D.C. And one, by the way, that's won national recognition for some of the work it's done in a city that has a lot of poor kids. I can take you about another 5 miles from there and take you to several schools that have bilingual programs because of the increasing number of children that we find who are limited English proficient, not necessarily not knowledgeable of English, but limited in their knowledge, and unless we do something to get them going, we'll lose them in the long run.
So we know in Los Angeles and California that Spanish and Spanish immigrants and the influx of Spanish immigrants is a growing population. That's not the only language issue. And how diverse has the language issue become in the country? We used to be able to say it was Spanish-English, and it was primarily a Southwestern, if you would, issue. How diverse is the language issue in this country now?
Let me tell you, you've got everything from Armenian, and in Los Angeles you've got a large Armenian population. You've got the Chinese dialects, not just one Mandarin language, but Chinese dialects. You've got the whole issue of all the Eastern Europeans that have come recently. Now, remember, bilingual education doesn't say you have to teach each child in that child's native language. What it says is figure out a way to capture the intelligence that child has and fashion it so that you can make yourself understood and teach that child who doesn't yet understand a whole lot of English. So it can be any number of different programs, as we said earlier. It's not just teach that child in that child's native language, zip, that's it. It's use what you need to, the tools you need to transition that child into full English instruction.
So the UNCE initiative then is particularly narrow and limited in its approach, because it seems to me that that at least in the way it's positioned in California, it talks pretty much about Spanish. It doesn't deal with the broader issues. And if it were to pass, what are the implications at the national policy level in terms of resources available for education?
Yeah. And let's make it real clear. Let's understand. I am one who does not support the UNCE initiative after having looked at it and having done a lot of work on the issue of bilingual education. It's a cookie-cutter approach. It says one size will fit all. This is a way where we'll teach all children who have a limited English proficient background, and this is the way all kids in the state, not just those who are limited English proficient, will be taught, because once you've gotten 1 year of instruction, whether you know English well or not, you're thrown into the regular course. The other thing that should be of concern to a lot of folks is that the initiative will allow people to sue teachers. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm in college right now and I'm preparing to teach and make a salary of somewhere starting off in the low 20s or so, it's not a lucrative business, but I love it that I have a chance to help children. I'm less likely to want to do this if I know that I can be subjected to a lawsuit at any point in time simply because I try to help a child quickly transition into English in whatever fashion I thought was best. That's a dangerous, I think, precedent to set, to allow people to just sue a teacher because maybe I don't like the way you're teaching something. That's a concern. Another concern is what is good for a 7-year-old may not be good for an 11-year-old. What is good for someone who knows some English may not be good for someone who knows more English. What is good for someone who knows little English certainly will not be good for someone who knows only English. And unfortunately, because it's a cookie-cutter approach, one-size-fits-all approach, all those kids are combined. You'll have a 7-year-old in the same classroom as an 11-year-old. So who do you teach? Or are you teaching the 11-year-old 7-year-old material? It's a difficult question to try to just say we're going to lump you all together, because as we know, especially in California, we've got a diversity of people, a diversity of thought. How you do it with a cookie-cutter approach, I don't see it.
Henry, that gives us kind of an overview of the discussion I had with Javier in Washington, D.C. But I think it might be good for our viewers to hear, and Javier has stated in that particular piece that he was decidedly opposed to the initiative. So I think as a starting point for our local discussion here, it'd be interesting to hear from the pro side of the initiative. And basically what I'm taking out of that interview now is the central question about the initiative itself. Is it a policy issue, or is it an attempt to to try to handle fixing the mechanics of bilingual education in the state?
Well, I think it's a little of both if you look at the initiative. Those that are opposed it seem to really feel that if you teach subject matter content in native language over a period of 3, 4, or 5 years, that at some time that knowledge will transfer over into English, because the primary instruction is in the kid's native language, and there's very little English involved in this process until a later time. This is a waste of time, because the kid eventually is going to have to learn it again in English. The biggest problem is that when you're dealing with 5-year-olds, 6 and 7, which here in Los Angeles, 60% of the elementary school kids are of Spanish-speaking, bilingual in some cases, monolingual in others. But if the 60% of these kids can only speak one language, and basically it's Spanish, then why continue to give them Spanish or even give them subject matter content in Spanish for a period of 2 or 3 years? It seems foolish. If you wish to teach them English as soon as possible, then begin by teaching them English. They speak Spanish at home. They read Spanish in many cases. They watch Spanish TV. They talk to each other in Spanish. When are they going to get the English knowledge? And I feel that if you waste that period of time, that window of opportunity, which is between 5, 6, and 7 years old, and do not teach them English sufficiently strong enough. I'm not talking about survival English. I'm talking about good, strong English plus reading and writing. You're going to have a kid that by the time he gets to junior high school will be put in remedial classes. And that's what's happened after 30 years.
Let me ask you this question, because the initiative points to a one-year period in which they'll be allowed to make this transition. As Javier pointed to, you know, you can't put the same suit of clothes on every student. Do you think that 1 year is sufficient to transition 100% of the native language speaking kids to English?
Yes. If you look at the initiative, it says not normally to exceed 1 year. These kids will be tested. If those kids can move in the direction of English-only classes, then it's not normally to exceed 1 year. They will be moved if they can. If they can't, who's going to say that they can remain a second year? The initiative doesn't say a second year, but it does say not normally to exceed 1 year. 1 year can include, remember, you're dealing with an entire year. For those of us that have to take foreign language to get into college, we don't take it 1 hour a day. This is going to be immersion where they're in that class for 5, 6 hours a day learning English. And they also will have the experience of, if they wish, after-school tutoring, or like in high school, come in on Saturday classes, or summer school. It's 1 year that they have this opportunity to learn English well enough. And for most kids, research says, for most kids that are first grade, second grade, third grade, you know, kindergarten, they learn very fast. They can pick it up easily and move on. Most of the students in some of the classes that I've visited were born here. They're American citizens. They were born here of migrant parents. Why should they be put into Spanish-only classes? When will they learn English well enough to succeed in junior high? And then they're in high school and consequently eventually in college.
Let me ask Jose, Henry points to the fact that it sounds like he's saying that it's an either-or kind of proposition. So you're either teaching them in their native language and then the introduction to English is slow, it's not full immersion. You know, former teacher, now with the union, what is your take as the opposition to those particular allegations?
Well, actually, first of all, I'm still a teacher. I'm on leave from my teaching position, so I've been a teacher, and I've been a teacher for 5 years. I'm just taking the last month or so off until the proposition of working on this specific issue. As far as teaching the kids what ESL is, we teach them for a certain period of time, and that's mandated period of time within the master plan for the school district.
In English?
In English.
Right.
ESL,
Yeah.
we teach.
Right.
There is a section in there. And I teach 6, 7, and 8 years old. I've taught second grade, third grade, fourth grade, which is my main focus area. What I do in there, I teach them in their primary language, and all these skills that I do teach them, once they acquire the English language, which within the master plan it says it'll take 3 to 4 years, not much more than what Mr. Gradias is saying. But once they acquire the skills, they are the same, and they absolutely and positively do transfer. If you teach a kid what a sentence is, you teach them where the capital letter goes, where the period goes, and which is the focus in second grade, teaching them sentence structure, paragraph writing, putting their thoughts together, organizational structure, organizing their stories, paragraphs, things like that. If you teach them about the Pilgrims and social studies, if you teach them about science, what weighs more, a rock or a feather, all that, once they learn between piedra and rock, once they learn the difference, sure, that transfer, that absolutely positively transfers. There is no doubt. I've seen it. I see it in my classroom every day. As far as transferring, yeah, it goes straight through. ESL, we do teach the kids ESL. We teach them every day. That is mandated. We have to teach them 3 things every day: ESL, PE of all things, and language arts, which are the 3 things that are the focus in our bilingual classroom. As far as leaving our school, I work at Belvedere Elementary, and as far as I know, at Belvedere Elementary, which also feeds into Garfield High School, which is where you were principal of, our kids will leave our school with a knowledge of Spanish, ability to write, to read, and understand Spanish, and they do leave our school with the ability to write and read and understand English. They are better prepared to go into junior high. Now, the focus is, are there some kids that do not reach that goal? Sure there are. There are some kids that do not reach that goal, just like they would have if it was not a bilingual program. If they would have, the issues are a lot more than just a bilingual program. They will have gone through, I mean, there's problems in the neighborhood, there's problems in the area, there's social economic issues that come up. And some of those kids, and I have them in my classroom, I see them every day, no matter what I do, I can sit there and try to do backflips to teach them how to do math or something. They have learning disabilities, they have psychological problems, they have emotional problems, and that stems not from the bilingual program itself, but from other factors that affect the community in which we live.
Maribel, let me get you into the conversation here. You're from MALDEF, and so you're neither an educator in this particular vein on either side of this issue, but you're kind of illustrate, or at least point for our viewers, what is MALDEF's concern about this particular issue, and what do you see as the heart of the issue?
First of all, as you pointed out earlier, just with regards to the conversation that was taking place, right now, by law, school districts, schools are required to teach children English. That's not even the issue. By law, schools are required to teach children English. Everyone agrees children should learn English. That is not the issue. From MALDEF's perspective, Proposition 227 is very dangerous. As Javier mentioned, first of all, it strips school districts and parents of the right to select the program that best fits the needs of their student population. This initiative is intended to affect over 1.4 million children throughout the state of California. We're talking about rural communities, we're talking about inner cities, elementary schools, high schools. We're talking about differences that are tremendous, and that school districts that have spent years developing a curriculum that's effective in teaching their students English and making sure that they advance academically, they're going to be dismantled completely. Not only bilingual education, but all current language development programs that are working, that have proven that to teach students English. Proposition 227 will eliminate that. We're also extremely concerned about the lawsuit that you mentioned. Any teacher who refuses to teach only in English, any teacher who tries to explain to a child a math problem, for example, can be sued by any parent or guardian. That is for attorney's fees. They will be personally liable. That's certainly a disincentive to bring in qualified teachers. And finally, this is a very costly initiative. It calls for retention of all current funding for bilingual education. So taxpayers will not save a penny because we're going to retain it. The initiative specifically says it. But it takes $50 million a year for 10 years from the General Education Fund. That makes no sense.
I want to come back to the $50 million and the whole cost issue, but I want to stay with the content, the idea of the program here. And Henry, I noticed you shaking your head about the when Maribel mentioned the idea of the lawsuits, and the teachers would be exposed to lawsuits.
Look, let's put it this way. The initiative clearly states that the teacher, if any teacher or if any district administrator, principal, or superintendent, if they continually refuse to implement 227, then there'll be litigation. But it says that a teacher must overwhelmingly teach in English. That is not what's being done right now, particularly in the elementary schools. So if you teach overwhelmingly in English, it does not say there that you can use Spanish or American Sign Language as the two language of this country, or use French or German or anything to embellish the course, to enrich the course, to make it more interesting. If you have this fear that a teacher will be sued if she says a word or two, I mean, that's not what the initiative says. Anything to teach the kid, but instruction, the books, the lessons, the tests themselves will be in English, and that's what we want.
Let me ask this question, though. It seems to me that there's some break in the logic here that I hear, at least in the numbers, because on the one hand, I hear that that bilingual teachers are underrepresented in the teaching population. And then you're saying now that the predominant language that education is taught in for these students is Spanish.
Yes.
So, I mean, how do you reconcile the fact that we don't have enough Spanish teachers, but the predominant teaching is done in Spanish, therefore we need the initiative?
The problem is, for those that are teaching right now, this is what they rely on. The lesson plans are in Spanish. I have visited them. Some of them are not doing a very good job because they don't have that kind of skill to be able to teach both languages well. And therefore the kid, after 2 or 3 years, ends up not learning either language well. See, the situation is in a true bilingual class, like we were mentioning before, and there are some here in the state of California. True bilingual classes cost money. The teachers must be well educated in both languages. Kids spend more time because it takes twice as long to teach both languages to a student, particularly when you're beginning to teach subject matter content. The problem is that after the first few years, this doesn't become cost effective. If a person were in junior high or in high school, it would be impossible to teach bilingual biology. You'd have to teach it in regular biology in English. The problem comes in, though, if a person has not learned by the time he's in high school to properly read and write and speak in English, there is no way these counselors are going to put him into chemistry or physics. That's what was wrong with Garfield High School.
Well, let me ask, because the question, it seems to me, it begs the question that is this a language problem or is this under-resourced problem? And, you know, if as Javier had said and Maribel and Jose say that it takes 3 to 4 years, how come we can't get it done in the 3 to 4 year period, which would be elementary school ideally, and then you make the transition to English and you put the resources in the first 4 to 5, even 6 years, so that you do have well-trained teachers.
I understand, but the biggest problem is that it doesn't transfer that readily when the kids are brought up this way, when you give primary instruction in their native language. That's been the problem. They don't transfer over. In other words, you have to kind of go over and repeat it again, and by that time you've lost these 3 or 4 years. They become critical. And all research shows that it can be done easier as they're younger.
How do you know it doesn't? I'm just trying to follow the logic. Wait. I'm just trying to follow the logic here. So we have programs that are under-resourced. We have programs that have teachers that are undertrained, that are teaching bilingual education, and the conclusion you're reaching is that bilingual education doesn't transfer. But how can you say that if those other factors that are broken are also in the environment? How do you get a clean evaluation of what works and doesn't?
I think you want me to say this, and I'll say it because I've said it before. Bilingual education as a part of the total educational system that this country, gives our students is not the major issue that's causing the problems of our kids not being well educated. You and I know it's rigor, it's attendance policies, it's the gang related, it's the kids not wanting to go to school, it's parents that can't have that hold on their kids. There's a lot of it forcing kids not to take these other classes by not giving them the rigor that is necessary to move in these classes or giving them choice. It's the grad requirements that require 2 years of graduation, 2 years of mathematics in high school to graduate without stipulating what those 2 years will be. So they take it in consumer math, baby math, ridiculous math. They don't take it in algebra, geometry, or where it should be. Those are, I think, the main problems in education. I'm a curriculum specialist. I got my doctorate in that. However, that's not on the ballot right now. What is on the ballot is bilingual ed, and that is a portion that drastically interferes, in my point of view, and in the years that I've had experience, which interferes with a person also progressing in learning English well enough to be able to succeed.
Go ahead, Mira.
I think he just said it beautifully. There are so many problems, and we need to fix our public education. And what is on the ballot on June 2nd is Proposition 227, a proposition, an educational requirement that will sweep across California with no research, no educational basis. The initiative, in fact, to further illustrate how unsound this initiative is and what chaos it'll cause, this initiative permits school districts to mix children of different ages and different grade levels in one classroom, with the only restriction being their level of fluency. There is no restriction in terms of age. These students will not receive the academic curriculum that it'll take to take the calculus and the algebra to go on to college. If, in fact, we were concerned about these students doing well and taking calculus, we need to continue to provide them with this academic instruction and not permit this unguided, unrestricted mixing of children of different ages. That is educationally unsound.
Jose, and I'll come back to you on this, Henry, but Jose, so speaking to Maribel's point about the mixing of ages, how important is that as a factor? And I'm just harking back to, my parents growing up, and they had one-room schoolhouses where, you taught from, elementary all the way through high school. How important is that issue of mixing ages in 1990?
It is very, very important. One of the things, and we just went through a classroom selection at our school, one of the things that most teachers try to avoid is a combination class. And you're just talking about 2 grades, 3rd, 4th, 4th, 5th, because of whatever the student population is. And most teachers want to avoid those kinds of classrooms because it is very difficult. You need to follow the curriculum for one grade and another grade. Now you have some kids from K through 5th. That is just amazing to be able to put them in there. You know, if anybody has kids or you have some children, when you take them somewhere, you do something with them, you're going to address different levels. You take them to a movie, you're going to take the 5th grader to a different movie than you do the kindergarten. It's just different mentality, different attention span, different ways of approaching them, different ways. I mean, with a kindergarten, you're going to use a lot of manipulators, a lot of tools, a lot of hands-on things. With a 5th grader, you're going to lecture to them. You're going to tell them a lot more things that they're going to be able to understand. Their attention span will be a lot longer. Now, how are you going to prepare a lesson to address all those? It's going to be a nightmare. It'll be very, very difficult to do.
See, the initiative clearly states that districts are permitted to do this if they wish. Obviously, in a school district as large as LA here, you already have the classes there. The class is there. It's a homogeneous class learning Spanish, basically, because most of the kids there speak Spanish. All we're saying is have that teacher now predominantly teach in English. There's no moving of kids around. But in smaller schools, just as you mentioned, the small school, in areas where you have small districts, where you have rural areas, what's going to keep a district saying, well, I can't teach immersion program in English because I have too few kids? You may be permitted to mix a 5th grader and a 6th grader and a 7th grader as long as they're in the same level of English proficiency. What is that going to hurt? For that year, they're going to be taking English proficiency, they're going to be learning English well enough, and they're going to be learning their alphabet. I mean, that first year, a lot of it's going to be language acquisition, how to speak, how to read, how to write. And the subject matter content will be also brought in there sparingly to make sure that they keep up. But once they learn sufficient English, they can keep up a lot faster by moving those 3 or 4 years in English-only classes than in continuing another 3 or 4 years in Spanish and then deciding to transfer over. It just doesn't work. It hasn't been. Practically, it doesn't work. And we've seen the results of how many kids are classified as fluent English speakers in the state of California. What is it, 6%? Santa Barbara with 2,800 limited English-speaking students. At the end of 1 year, only 6% were actually reclassified into fluent English. It doesn't work. It isn't working. It's getting worse, and it's been on the books for 30 years. It expired in 87, and it's still on the books. It continues to be funded because the legislature refuses to do anything about it because of the conflicts. Well, this initiative will do something about it. In fact, the governor already vetoed a bill. The courts have already said, hey, we're not going to be requiring school districts to mandate them to give bilingual ed. The legislature are saying, let's drop some more. It's a wonderful thing. This bill does anything. It's waking up the American people to say, hey, we got to look at a program that hasn't worked for 30 years, and we're going to substitute it with something that others say might not work at all, but at least it's a change. And I'm pretty sure that if those kids are put into English only with the same caring teachers we have now, it'll work, and those kids will move a lot faster than they're moving now.
Maryville, we're going to break in 1 minute, but I want to give you a chance to comment on this notion of moving to change into something that we don't have any track record on. What are your...
I've listened to Mr. Gradias explain his view of the world and his view of educational policy a few times, and sometimes I agree that it makes sense. What he's saying sometimes makes sense. Unfortunately, what he says is completely inconsistent with what's in Proposition 227. The reality is that if Proposition 227 were to pass on June 2nd, that is what becomes the law. Not what Mr. Gradias suggests, that their rural schools may be permitted, but urban schools may not. That restriction's not in the initiative. The after-school programs, the Saturday programs, that's not in the initiative. What he says, unfortunately, is not written in there, and that is what would become law. And I think it's really interesting that we have a bipartisan bill coming out of the legislators that took a significant amount of time, that brought in researchers to have educational policy, and Governor Pete Wilson vetoed it.
Maryville, before we go to break, we have, is it Zaja on the line?
Hi.
Hi, welcome to Media One-on-One. You have a question for our guest?
Yes. My question is, actually, I'm not agree with bilingual education. I'm actually right now I'm learning English. I'm here for 1 year, and I believe bilingual education is going to stop learning for students. But my question is, do you think only 1 year is going to be enough for them to, after that, they're going to throw the student to the regular classes?
Henry, let's direct that question to you, and then, Jose, you can...
Yeah, as I said before, if you're talking about the little kids, the kindergarten, first, second, third, 1 year is sufficient for them to learn, particularly when 60% of them in many of the classes are already American-born, American citizens that should be given this opportunity to learn English. For the high schoolers, or those people that come into this country at a later age, you know, you can begin to look at waivers to get them into bilingual programs. But to me, personally, this is going to take an extra year or two. Why not bring them in a quick submersion program and then into the classes of straight English?
Jose, is 1 year sufficient?
No, it's not sufficient. Absolutely not. There is no way a child can learn. You know, and as an adult coming into this country, you come in and you go through a program to learn a language. Sure, you'll be able to speak it and talk it, but are you able to pick up a book and read it in another language? You will not. And we're not talking here about verbal speaking or verbal communication. We're talking about an academic knowledge of the language. We're talking about reading, writing it, learning it from an academic perspective. Now it brings a very...
Before you go there, we have one more caller.
Sure.
Before we go to break. So I think it's Fab from LA. Welcome to Media One-on-One.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate this discussion. First of all, I'm going to say this real quick. Other countries start off at earlier ages teaching different languages with several different levels, and I feel like that will be okay here. But I also would like to have your opinion as to teaching Spanish to English-speaking children. What about that, reversing the role?
We currently have programs throughout California. We have a diversity of programs. We have the dual immersion that allows monolingual English-speaking students to learn Spanish. We have some great programs throughout California that will be completely dismantled. You're absolutely right. It seems kind of ironic that as we move on to a global economy, as we rely more on foreign trade, that California wants to be the one state that prohibits students from learning more than one language. We should be encouraging students to learn 2 and 3 different languages.
Henry?
The initiative plainly states that if a kid already knows, a student already knows English, and he wishes now to learn a language other than his own in elementary school, that it's wonderful to do that if the parents wish to put him in there. Well, this is a reverse of what it is now.
Let me ask the question this way, because as Muriel points out, and we recognize the world's getting smaller, that the English culture, American culture, is one of the few countries where multiple languages isn't the norm. You go to Europe and people are speaking 3 or 4 different languages. What are your thoughts about having a standard that would immerse English-dominant speakers in foreign languages the same way they're talking about immersing Spanish speakers in English?
Yes, that is outstanding, because these researchers have known for years that if a person begins to learn another language early enough other than his own, he will be able to master that language. So therefore, we should be putting more effort and money into elementary school to get those monolingual students to learn another language. There's no problem with that. I'm working in Duluth, Minnesota, and we got programs in there right now that we're working particularly in this area. See, I've never said that it was anti-bilingualism. The more languages you know, multilingual, multilingualism, to me it's great, but if you want to succeed in this country, if you really want to make money here, if you're multilingual, one of those languages has got to be English, or you won't be able to capitalize on your multilingual abilities.
Well, when we come back from break, I want to talk about what are some of the implications with the implementation. So let's assume that the bill passes, and then let's assume that it doesn't pass, and what do we do to make some of the corrections? But don't go away. We'll be right back with today's topic, Proposition 227, the Bilingual Education Initiative. Stay with us and do join in the conversation after the break. Okay. All right. Obviously, the conversation's been very lively while you've been away, but welcome back to today's topic, Proposition 227, the Bilingual Education Initiative. I'm Perry Parks, your host. We encourage you to participate in our discussion with our guests, because they've been participating without you, for sure. Once again, the viewer call-in number is area code 310-216-3590. Again, that's area code 310-216-3590. Our state has approximately 1.4 million English-speaking students. That's more than the total public school population of about 38 states. It is estimated that there is only one bilingual teacher for every 92 students, leaving a high percentage of children without any special assistance to obtain fluency in English. Governor Pete Wilson just vetoed a bill passed by the State Assembly that would have given local schools the freedom to implement bilingual instruction according to their needs. Will a state-controlled mandate be more successful than leaving it up to local schools to decide what the individual needs are for their non-English speaking students? So I think that we've kind of arrived at that juncture here, and What are your takes on that? Will a state initiative really be more effective than allowing local control of the issue, of this particular issue?
Well, one of the reasons I feel that the governor vetoed that is because that would be the status quo. Just continue the same thing. See, what started the initiative in the first place? It was parents that boycotted a school for over 2 weeks because they were refused their chance of moving their kids into English-only classes. They were tired of having their kids come home with homework, everything in Spanish. When are they going to learn English? And after 2 or 3 years, no, this is the problem. Right. So they decided that, hey, I want my kids in English classes. I don't want them to work like, I talked to a parent that's working in the sweatshops there on 7th and Maple in the garment district. She doesn't want her child to be there. When is he going to learn English? I don't know that much English. I'm forced to do this. What's wrong with teaching kids English as soon as possible?
But we have 180 days. Jose, we have let's get Estella. Estella, welcome to Media One-on-One.
Good evening. How are you?
Good. Do you have a question for our guest?
Well, a comment and a question. What I see is a lot of people getting all hyped up about bilingual education and demanding it. As a Hispanic, I say, why? Who are we to demand bilingual education? As a child, when I was growing up, there was no such thing as bilingual education. I spoke primarily Spanish as a child. In the household, it was nothing but Spanish. And, of course, I went to school and learned English. As you can see, I speak English very well, and I'm proud to say I speak Spanish very well as well. I didn't lose either one of my languages or the culture. And why is it mostly the Hispanics that are demanding bilingual education? I don't see Orientals demanding it. I don't see any other races making such a big deal about it.
Well, let me go to Jose with that question, Estella. Dominated by Spanish for sure, given the size of the population.
Absolutely.
Is there concern on the part of other ethnic foreign language speaking minorities?
There is concern. First of all, let me address the first part, then I'll go ahead and do that. As far as who are we, what are we are also voters, we are taxpayers, we are in this country. I came here to this country when I was 8 years old, so also went through a bilingual program. I'm able to either both speak English and Spanish, so yeah, I wanted it, I got it, it works. And then as far as other ethnicities, other races that are working on this, I went to a press conference which was held last week at Castro Elementary, in particular the Chinatown area, and there was media from Korea, from China, from a variety of different Asian-speaking languages, and they were adamantly opposed to this. They had a press conference there with reporters and representatives from every different sector of the Asian community. So they are very concerned. Obviously, we don't see them as much. We're not in tune with it because they are a small group within the bilingual education program. And anytime you look at bilingual education, it's going to be focused towards Latinos, Hispanics, Mexicans.
How many different languages are spoken in the LA Unified School District? Is there any?
Well, when I was at Birmingham, we had 42 different nationalities.
Up to now, the languages that are spoken in LA Unified, the last I knew, there were 87. 87 different languages.
And the only basic one, the Latino, gets put into these 3 or 4 years of bilingual stuff, and the others are put into English only, and guess what the results are at the end of the 2 or 3 year period?
But that is because we do not have the funding. We have 1.4 million students that need this type of education.
Yeah, and only a third are getting it.
We are only getting 30%.
Only a third are getting it. This would bring them all under the umbrella of immersion.
Mr. Gradius, if you implement this proposition and you only fund it at 30%, how do you think it will function?
Who's going to fund it at 30%?
Well, whatever you do, if you only put 30% of the effort into it, it is not going to function.
Let's move then to this question. Let's assume for a moment here that the initiative passes and it goes into effect. I guess it's going to be January?
No, within 2 months after
2 months, okay, 60 days. Okay,
60
it
days.
goes into effect
so by September,
days.
when the next school year starts,
okay,
they should be implementing this
June,
if it passes.
So by September of 1998, it would have to be implemented. What are the consequences of that particular implementation? What can a parent look forward to, or what should a parent be anticipating with an implementation happening in 60 days?
They can be expecting complete chaos. I have gone out to the different school districts throughout California talking to superintendents on their interpretation of the initiative and what they expect will happen, given the fact that the initiative is so vaguely worded. Okay, it's so vaguely worded, and if that were the only issue, we might be able to resolve it. But school districts have to figure out how to implement this program, how to completely eliminate, because it's going to be costly to eliminate what they currently do, and implement a new program within 60 days with the threat of a lawsuit if they fail to implement this vague statute. Who will come in and sue them? People like Mr. Gradias, people like Mr. Unz, who will want to make an example out of the school districts that have a true commitment to teaching their students English. It will be complete chaos, not only for the limited English proficient students, who, according to this initiative, can be warehoused for an entire year. And your last caller says, we Hispanics want bilingual education. No, equality of education, access to the core curriculum that all the other children are having. Proposition 227 is not about bilingual education. It's about warehousing children for an entire year and denying them academic instruction.
Henry, so it's now June 8th. The initiative passed. What, and you were principal, so putting that principal's hat on, what do you see would have to occur between June 8th and September to have your plant, your school plant ready to implement this particular
Progressive districts, okay, progressive districts have already got a lot of plans going on right now because they knew this was coming way back in, in the summer of last year. If they waited this long, yeah, they're going to have some problems if they waited for the last summer waiting saying hopefully it's defeated. But that's ridiculous. I mean, there should always be plans, and that's what's wrong with some of the districts. You know, they're not planning hard enough. What I see is this, and I really mean this because I've been to these schools and I've seen it. It shouldn't be any chaos whatsoever. You keep the same teacher assistants. Now you just tell them you're going to keep your same pay for what you're doing, but now you're going to concentrate on English to these kids rather than Spanish. I was in a class where the teacher met these kids and said, "Buenos días, alumnos, ¿cómo estamos? ¿Cómo pasaron la semana? Vamos a hablar sobre los colores," and started teaching the colors. Everything was in Spanish, and I waited to see, was this the introduction? No. English is only taught there for 1 hour a day. Instead, Spanish is taught for the remaining of the school day.
No, but is that a management issue? Is that a
yes, it's management. And now all the teachers got to do is use it the other way around. Spend 60 and 80% of the time teaching the same class that she has in her room in English rather than in Spanish.
That's not what the initiative calls for. That's not what where does it say 80% English and 20% Spanish?
Or 90%.
You don't say that. It does not say that on the initiative.
Time out. We have Elaine here. Let's get another viewer's perspective on this. Elaine, welcome to Media One-on-One.
Good evening to all of you. I'm very concerned about this Spanish-English program. Frankly speaking, I would prefer that the children learn to speak more Asian languages. After all, they are the ones who carry most of the money and most of the business. I think we're putting too much emphasis on American people having to speak Spanish, and frankly, I resent it. And that's all I have to say. Good luck on the answer.
All right, thank you.
I agree with that. But you see, the Asian culture, they will learn, the parents will take the responsibility of keeping that culture alive. I know that they have Japanese school on Saturdays. My association with many of the Asia when I was here in Alhambra in Monterey Park is that they want the schools to teach their kids English so they'll have a much better shot at moving on, like she is saying. And why shouldn't we teach, you know, kids other language other than Spanish? But what I'm saying, it's easy.
What you're pointing to now here is you make reference to the fact that the Japanese culture will keep the culture alive. Now, is that to say that the Latino culture won't, or any other group will not keep the culture alive?
No, but there is some fear that if you do not continue, that the schools, if they do not continue to provide language maintenance in Spanish for their kids, that the kids will be too Anglicanized. They will begin to learn English too well and will forget their culture. And I'm saying to them, you know, why would you like language maintenance at the expense of English? I sure want one for my kids. I want them to learn English and they're going to live here well enough and hopefully maintain their culture. Hopefully.
Jose, is that really the view of the opponents?
No, it's not. Maintaining English, yeah, that's great. You talk to any bilingual educator, anybody who's involved with bilingual education, they want the kids to learn English. That is not, we're not trying to keep them from learning English. Now, as far as a multilingual society, multilingual culture, multilingual world that we live in, we need to know that. We need to learn that.
Well, why not teach it?
We are teaching it. That's exactly what we're doing. We are teaching the Spanish language. Yes, some kids come in, we say buenos dias, ¿cómo están? All this stuff. That's great. We do that. We also teach English. We are teaching English. Now, the programs that you alluded to earlier, where they were pulled out and were able to learn English and were put in English class, the one that you alluded to, they didn't redesignate anybody. They did not redesignate anyone.
I have another question.
How was it that, how were they prepared? How were they prepared not to go into another English class? They did not redesignate anyone.
And the Alice
1 year,
Callahan kids from
180
9th Street
days.
School that you're talking about, those are the children we're talking about that you harmed, that you hurt because they are the ones that scored the lowest on the exams.
Alice Callahan's position is that she's a proponent of 227.
Right.
She says that these kids need to be taught English and they're being delayed that. So.
But the difference, I don't know who he's speaking to about retaining the culture, because the parents that we have worked with, and we work with a lot of parents throughout California and throughout Texas of children who are limited English proficient, guess what they want? They want their children to learn math. They want their children to learn English. They are not worried about their children working in the garment industry. They're worried about preparing their child to be doctors and lawyers and getting into college. It infuriates me to no end when I hear the proponents of Proposition 227 set the standard at a garment industry. That's what you continue to hear. These children should not be working at a garment industry. That's a given. These children should be doctors and lawyers, but if they're not provided the math and the science, if they are prohibited and denied for an entire academic year, they cannot catch up. That is not equality. We're not talking about here. They framed the question as Spanish only. We have Asian bilingual classes. We have a wonderful Armenian bilingual program. All these programs are intended to teach children English, but advance them academically.
So I want to go back to the cost here. Now, the one model that I've read about has been the model in Orange County, where they have moved to a full immersion program similar in nature, at least in the reading, to what 227 proposes. And what does that experience look like? Have you looked at it, Jose?
No, I have not. I'm not.
All we know is that the teachers have certainly been leaving the school district, that parents have pulled their children out of the school district because they know the harm that will cause in placing these children in these classes. We don't hear them talking about all the over 300 parents who have to pull their children out of public schools because their children are not being taught the academic instruction.
What do you hear, Henry?
I hear that whenever there's, like you say, chaos and a problem, that problem exists because people don't put their whole hearts into a program. And I think when you have
they haven't done to the bilingual program.
No, you have done this.
haven't done
teachers,
to the bilingual program.
Teachers right now are not willing. They say, we're going to, I get into my room and I close that door and I'm going to do what I want to do. The problem that we see now is that when the students begin to know that they're going to be in that class and they have X number of months or a year to learn what has to be learned, you're beginning to see an improvement. Why? Because it's done in English. It's not going to take that length of time to move these kids into English only, since they're already from day one beginning to study that in English. That is critical to be able to analyze the nuances of the language. If these kids miss that, and they miss those 3 or 4 vital years of learning this, when are they going to get it? They're sure not going to get it in junior high, because there they do the same thing. I've known kids, many kids, hundreds of kids that have been in this country for 5 and 6 years that still can't read or write English well enough to be put into classes where they can absorb the math and the science. She talks about academic advancement. What academic advantage do you have for young kids that are studying in the first year immersion in English? It's basic language acquisition. You don't start teaching calculus that age group, but I'm telling you this, and I understand this very, very closely, that if you teach these kids in Spanish sufficiently long enough, when will the transition period come across where they learn English? It doesn't come across. And when it finally does, they're too far behind.
Let me give you an analogy real quick. And this is talking to some people. About 10, 15 years ago, they came out with this problem with science. We don't have enough women in science. Women cannot get in science. Now, it would have been ludicrous to get little girls into science and say, you know what, you guys aren't doing it. You're not learning the science. You're not getting that through. It would have been ludicrous to stop science, to say, you know what, you're not doing it. You're not going to learn English, you're not going to learn math, you're not going to learn health, you're not going to do anything else. Get into a classroom and spend 180 days, and that's when we're going to get you up to par with the rest of the kids in your class, and they would have been a grade level behind. Now, nobody in this country would have gone for a proposition. Now, in essence, that's what you're trying to do to the kids. You are saying, forget math, forget science, forget health. We are going to teach you this particular subject because, I'm sorry, you just can't learn it any other way. And we're telling you, we know what you're doing. We're going to do it this way, and that's it. It would have been teaching kids science in one particular methodology, not the teacher doing their lesson.
You want to teach that girl science,
and we're going to wrap after this comment, so I'm going to give you a chance to have the last comment, so go ahead.
No, I'm just saying this analogy. There's nothing wrong with a person knowing, like soccer. If he knows soccer, he wants to come to the United States, he can't play soccer because as a high school, so he wants to get into high school football. Obviously, his knowledge of soccer you know, he's a senior or a high school student, his knowledge of soccer will help. We here hire kids to kick the ball for goals because they're good soccer kickers. And then he's going to transfer a lot of these traits into what he already knows, the physical ability, the running ability, the kicking ability. But let's say this student comes to us, he doesn't know anything about soccer as far as playing it. See, my proponents think that
I'm going to have to wrap here, Henry.
that it's best to do what? It's best to teach them soccer for 2 years in order to learn American football. No, put them right in American football.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of this particular edition, so we'll have to wait till June 2nd to see how this works out. But as our viewers, you can see this issue is a live issue, and you're going to have to sort it out for yourself, and I would say vote your conscience on this one. Today's program will be rebroadcast over this and numerous other channels, including the California channel. Watch for days and times at the end of the program. Be sure to join us again on Tuesday, June 2nd at 7 p.m. And thank you for joining us today, and have a good evening.